So this is a 4-hour session, and I really want some interactivity. I could say it's because I haven't prepared actually 4 hours worth of material. You guys need to help me out here. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I've got some topics prepared and some examples, but really this is the advanced version, so presumably if you're not familiar with Homer, you probably are better off in the other session. So then if you are familiar with Homer, there's got to be some things about it that either frustrate you, confuse you, or you want to know more about, et cetera. So I made some guesses as to what topics I thought people would be most likely to be interested in. But you just tell me what topics you're most that you are interested in, and I'll stick them up here and get to them. So I'm going to jump ahead in the presentation here just to show you, give you some thoughts as to what topics I thought you'd most likely be interested in. In Homer, we call it operating reserve. It's also called spinning reserve. I don't know which term is more confusing because batteries don't spin, and load management, I like to think of that as reserves just like any other kind of reserve. If it's managed correctly, of course, it doesn't spin either. One of the earlier presenters today said, well, if you have enough load management, then you don't need spinning reserve. So it depends how you look at it. But anyway, this is the same concept of reserve. It's really important. I think it's the top of my list here. And it's not, and it actually is kind of confusing. So that's one topic that I assume we're going to want to talk about. Advanced storage options, we've been talking about flywheels a fair amount. That's a new feature in Homer. But we also have some new flow batteries in Homer, and we've changed the way you create a new battery in Homer, so that's important. Diesel maintenance is something that Homer hasn't focused a lot on in the past, and basically, feedback from many different people, including a lot of folks in Alaska, has convinced me to change the way we handle diesel maintenance. We're coming out with a new version. I'll show you a screenshot from it. This is your opportunity to have some input into some of the features and interfaces for the version 3. Diesel maintenance is one of the things we definitely want to change. Advanced wind resource parameters is everybody's familiar with the Weibull K, I think, or that's a really standard statistic that's used to describe the wind resource. In Homer, we also have something we call the autocorrelation factor, which is not as common, but is very important for systems with storage, or off-grid systems, or systems that have to stand on their own. And so Homer has a way of taking monthly averages and turning that into a realistic time series, reasonably realistic time series, and that's an important capability that people should understand. I think it's really valuable because a lot of times, especially on smaller projects, you don't have hourly data. Dispatch strategies, load management we've mentioned, and then the bottom half are things that maybe we should vote on whether these are of interest to the group or not. So I won't belabor the point right now, except to mention what XML stands for. It's a data protocol, and so we have a capability within Homer to import and export component data from Homer, create your own XML library. It's a very handy, convenient way to reuse stuff you've already done. it's really, it's just mostly a convenience, but it actually is really helpful. So, and it's hidden. It's not. How many people know that Homer had this capability? Yeah. So it's pretty well hidden. Yeah. So I thought I should tell you about it. In the new version, it won't be. We're just going to stop hiding stuff like that. But before I jump into that, I wanted to lead with that just to get you all thinking about, well, what do I want to hear about? And you can blurt it out, or you can write it down and pass it up. Either way. What I'm going to do first, though, because we have plenty of time, is a little background information. You know, who is Homer Energy? If it's been a while since I've been up in Alaska, so I'd like to sort of reintroduce myself to everybody here. So I'm going to jump back to the beginning. Our motto is clean power everywhere, with this emphasis on everywhere. I mean, the beauty of these microgrid systems or remote power systems is that really is a way to provide power anywhere. And it's kind of a niche that we specialize in and that you're involved in, of how to provide reliable power, maybe it should say anywhere, I don't know. And this, we're in Alaska, and Alaska is sort of the center for a lot of this activity, but it's really is a global need. There's a lot of activity in Australia, obviously. There's a lot of potential all over the world. Everywhere that's not that bright there, on that screen, where people live, they need power and they don't have a big grid. That's where these hybrid systems really shine, and that's where we focus. And so the world is trying to go to renewable power, clean power, and they're talking about smart grids, big topic of conversation. But I truly believe that the way we're going to get there is with microgrids. So what you all are doing here is really path-breaking, trailblazing, pioneering, what's the right metaphor, but creating expertise and experience that's going to be incredibly valuable very soon all over the world, including on the large grids, because they're moving slower, because they're bigger, to higher penetrations of renewables. Right now, they're at a level that they can do it simple, just stick some renewables on the grid absorbs the variability, it's a drop in the, drop in the ocean, if you will, and they don't need to worry about these issues. But as the level of penetration increases, eventually the expertise that we're developing here becomes valuable even on large grids. And so we are the pioneers, and that is how I believe we're going to get to high penetrations of renewable. The grandiose visions of a centralized smart grid that can handle all this control and let your big utility company control all your millions of appliances has enormous regulatory and security obstacles. Whereas if you do it at the microgrid level, actually I thought Russell's slide where he showed the centralized control versus decentralized control, it was perfect. It just is safer, simpler, more robust in a decentralized kind of system. You've seen this slide already, so I need to collect royalties or something from people. But he said, I'm not going to repeat it. He said it as well as I did, and it's the same point. But just trying to figure out what's best really does depend on the kinds of inputs that Homer asks for. What are your resources? How do they vary seasonally, daily, etc.? What are your loads? What do things cost, and how well do they work? the utility industry has some really complex tools that are very expensive. I mean, $100,000 a year is a common license fee for Ventix's suite of models. And that's fine for large utilities, but it's useless for the kind of projects we're talking about. So we need simpler tools. That's why we developed Homer. I also think that simpler tools are better for generating the insight and understanding that's required to move the industry forward. With the complex models, you could spend several days developing your inputs or weeks or whatever, and you make one or two runs. You come up with a base case and maybe two scenarios around it, and those are your results, and you go to your regulatory hearing and say, I need more money because this is what the computer said. But you're not really generating any understanding of what's happening. The guy maybe running the model is, but that's this team of specialists. That's just not the way we need to operate. We need a much larger numbers of people to sort of understand, well, why do you need storage and how much storage do you need? Do you really need 4 hours of storage, or is 15 minutes really enough? What's the trade-off between fuel usage and more turbines or more storage or more, there's some intuition that you can develop by running models yourself in an iterative fashion. So the more broadly we can disseminate that capability, the faster everything moves forward. So that's sort of my philosophy about modeling is it's not a priesthood, it's something that needs to be distributed widely. Homer was originally developed as the simple model. It grew in complexity over time. Version 3 that we're working on is going to have a simple version. We're not sure whether to call it Homer Simple, Homer Light, Homer Express, something like that. And as a stepping stone, so maybe that's enough for some people, but it's a learning tool to get more people involved and a stepping stone to the more complex versions. A little bit of history about it. It started in 1993 as part of the Village Power Program. There's several people here. Steve Drier was part of the Village Power Program. Ian Baring-Gould was part of it. Pierre Lunziger was sort of an advisor to it. So I want to give a little bit of credit to NREL for creating this Village Power Program, which is long gone, sort of history now, but it's worth mentioning. We started releasing it to the public in '98, and it sort of took off. We have over 50,000 users now, so it's not really NREL's role to support a global user base. And for a whole variety of reasons, it made sense to spin off and create a private company, which we've done. Last year, we enhanced it a little bit, so that's what 2.81 is an enhancement over the original Homer. It's not a major enhancement, frankly, so we're only charging $100 for it. Version 3 will be a much more substantial enhancement, and we'll have multiple versions of it for different applications. So we'll have a wind diesel version. And it's still under development. This is one of our sort of prototype user interfaces. So this is like the public unveiling of what the user interface might look like. It's a more modern platform for user interfaces. So let me jump into talking a little bit more about Homer. The colors aren't coming through here. Oh, and I should. So there's a mental model or a paradigm that's fundamental to the way Homer works. It's this decision analysis framework, if you will, where, and the best way for me to think about it is these nested do loops, or this layering. At the innermost layer, we're meeting the load in every hour. So you have resources. Are they enough to meet the load? What is your load? Do you need to turn on a diesel? Do you need to charge or discharge a battery? And it does that time step by time step through a whole year. It's typically an hour, but it can be as short as a minute. I've got some examples of some analysis that we did in 1 minute time steps, which is, of course, slower. So that's at the hourly level. It does that for an entire year, and that tells you how one system operates for 1 year. And from that, you can extrapolate over its lifetime. But that's how one system operates. So that's a simulation tool. You simulate many different systems under the same conditions and rank them by life cycle cost or net present cost. That's the optimization layer. So it tells you what's best, but it also lets you look at the full range of different systems and how do they compare and how much better really is it, et cetera. And that's the optimization layer. So that's, we do the energy balance for one time step, then we do it for many time steps, and that's a simulation, and then we do that many times over and compare them. That's the optimization. That tells you what's best for a particular situation, for a particular fuel price or wind speed, variety of parameters like that that you don't have control over. So in the optimization layer, it's varying design variables that you have control over, telling you what to do, what's best. In the sensitivity analysis layer, it's saying, okay, what about all the stuff I don't have control over? Is the answer to this question of what's best, does that change, or how robust is that? Because I really don't know what my wind speed is. I think I know what it is, maybe, or maybe not, you know, or nobody knows what fuel prices are going to do. Anybody that tells you, these pundits that predict the price of oil next year, they're nuts. This is silly, you know, so there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And that's what the sensitivity analysis is useful for. And that's just the outermost do loop, if you will, of, well, we did an optimization, now let's do a whole lot of different optimizations varying the different parameters. So by using this nested decision analysis approach, that's how we come up with these graphs that you've already seen, again. But, you know, imitation's the greatest form of flattery, right, I guess. But this is my favorite graph, and I think Russell explained it pretty well, that I guess the one thing I should elaborate on, based upon a question this morning actually, this is a very small, this happens to be the results for a tiny village in the Philippines. So one, it's small, which means their off-peak loads are really small. And so that's why batteries are in the optimal solution in all cases here, is because it's such a small village with small off-peak loads. The other thing is it's in the Philippines, so it's near the equator, which is why solar does so well. In some places, the solar and wind complement each other, and in other places they don't. You know, if it's sunny and if winter is your windy season, which is fairly common, then there might be some complementarity there. In Alaska, probably not so much, although with oil prices the way they are, I actually was asked to look at solar in Alaska, which I wouldn't have done if somebody hadn't asked me to do it. And it wasn't cost effective, but it wasn't as off by nearly as much as I expected to, because they were using $6 or $7 a gallon as delivered fuel price. And they had a diesel that was running inefficiently, and probably made more sense to replace the diesel with a more appropriately sized diesel, et cetera. But the fact that solar was closer than I expected is the kind of surprise that you get when you do modeling. If you were never surprised by your results, well, you'd feel like a genius, but you'd also, it sort of undercut the reason why you bother doing modeling. It's like you already knew all the answers, right? So it's when you get surprises that is the most valuable part of modeling. So have you all had a chance to think about this? This might be a good time to throw it out to the audience. What other topics should go on this list that we could prioritize? I'm sorry?
Dispatch strategies.
Dispatch strategies. Well, that's on there, but you
Okay.
I won't forget.
You got construction in there at all?
Con- Construction costs?
Right.
Okay, who's talking? Oh, there you are.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we have a capital cost. What do we mean by capital cost? So let me put that on this list here. Actually, that probably fits nicely on the, what, kind of economic nerd speak when I talk about nonlinear cost tables, but that would be a good time to mention that, to discuss.
But adding wind forecast, I think that could be an advantage.
Wind forecasting?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's a good one.
Historical data. I mean, as far as whatever historical data may be available in relation to wind forecasting or location or weather patterns.
So that might be
Site historical data.
data, historic, or other, like where do you get the data, right?
And what's available and how do you plug it in?
Right.
Just put a little focus on the storage discussion. I'm interested in what advances you made looking at short-term storage and analyzing the benefits of short-term storage, which historically Homer hasn't really provided for.
Right. So actually, I'm gonna put these ones that are already on, I'm gonna make another column, because these are already on the list, and you're just saying, emphasizing them, I guess.
I guess follow up on what Steve said, also on the data, if you've got large blocks of historical data, what's the best way to aimlessly
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
how do you prioritize that?
Data entry, I mean,
well, if you're going from hourly data to 15-minute or 1-minute or 30-second data, so you've got huge data files that you want to import into Homer, how exactly do you do that?
format and inputting.
So that you can get into the better model.
Right.
Advanced storage.
Two these issues. One is spinning reserve, and the other one is minimum load of diesels.
Oh, minimum load on diesel, that's, yeah. Thank you. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I've had some frustration with using Homer was consideration for losses in turbines, wind turbines. And I'm not sure how that's doable in Homer. So I think that's something we can discuss. And also air density considerations. When winter time, air density increases, so how can that be part of the Homer modeling? But the losses, I mean losses in terms of turbine availability, and then losses due to things like contamination from icing or from inefficiency in the turbine itself. How can that be modeled in Homer?
right, okay.
Does Homer include taking into account the increased inefficiency as units age? So PV production goes down over time, diesel generators get less efficient as they were starting to wear out. Turbine, I assume would be the same.
Right, right. Short answer is no.
Okay.
Maybe, okay, we're topic done.
All right, got one off of it.
As far as time steps, I know the minimum is on the minute basis. Is that ever going to be advanced to the second basis so you can model fast response storage more accurately?
So the short answer to that is, well, no, it's not a short answer. Homer itself really, I don't think would work very well at timeframes of less than a minute. But a hope I have, I don't have funding for it, but I've talked about this for a while, and there's seems to be some interest in developing an interface between Homer and, there are models that do that kind of dynamic, that's a dynamic model, or transient analysis, or it's not really my expertise, frankly, but I do think that we could integrate Homer with that kind of model, and so you can pass data back and forth. And there's probably people in this room who know more about dynamic modeling than I do. Actually, I know there are people. The impression I have about it, and speak up and refute it or reinforce it, is that those models need to look at events. They need to look at a 10-minute scenario, and they're not going to look at a whole year. So we could run Homer, we could take an event from Homer, send it to a more detailed model with better, where you get the 1 second data. Well, maybe you don't, you have to probably generate a little bit of that data yourself to define the scenario, run that model, see what happens, come back and make some kind of assumptions about how frequent or that kind of event would be, bring it back into Homer.
I see what you're saying.
Does that sound like a reasonable plan to those people who used the transient and the stability models?
I don't see the value of it.
Well,
I see
here.
the value in both types of modeling, but merging them, I don't necessarily see the value.
Well, so my thinking is this, that Homer tells you what's economic, but it doesn't tell you so much, or in that level of detail, what's feasible or what's stable. I mean, we use the term feasible, but what is it really stable? The dynamic models tell you it's stable, and you can always make something stable by loading on more equipment and more cost. So you can easily come up with something that's stable, but it's not economic. So you really need both, and it really is kind of an iterative process, back and forth between the two. And so, as a convenience to users, that's my thought, is let's make it as easy as possible to iterate between the two. That's mine.
One other thing, and I may not have just seen it, but the degradation of the battery storage capacity over time, I mean, you can say it lasts so many years, but it doesn't really get into the storage capacity degradation.
Yeah, that's this agent.
Okay.
With lead acid batteries, now tell me if anybody, this is my impression. I'm not really a battery expert so much, but lead acid batteries, when they start to fail, they really start to fail. They kind of fall off a cliff, kind of. And so maybe it's not so bad going, okay, well, they're fine, they're dead. Yeah. What I've heard is that other types of batteries, lithium batteries and nickel batteries, fail or degrade in a much more gradual way. But I don't have real data about that. So if anybody does, that would be useful to know. The flow battery folks, actually, is Chris here? So, yeah, so tell me a little bit about what you expect the batteries to do after, 6 or 7 years or something.
There is, with the cleaning process that we use with zinc technology, a pretty constant degradation rate, not unlike what PV panels have 1% loss of nameplate efficiency per year. It was pretty constant with usage
And it's at that point, it's not a failure mode, and I have a lead acid battery background, so I'm not knocking them. You're exactly right, Peter. Lead acid batteries reach a tipping point, and you do various internal chemical process, it's on the cliff, and it's got to replace the maybe with the bathwater. Flow batteries, our technology, what I know about some other manufacturers, it's a degradation to an uneconomic, not necessarily a failure mode, where there's some membrane cell stack, just like fuel cells, that needs a replacement consumable component that needs to be replaced, usually not the entire system, usually a subset of parts. And that can be modeled.
Yeah.
As a recurring OpEx, CapEx, 5-year interval, and basically very easily.
Right. So Homer's legacy was it was originally the simple model. I still think it is a simple model, but it's gotten more and more complex over time, and it's starting to be used in ways. It's starting to be used more than we anticipated back in 1993. So I originally had this attitude of a 1% a year effect. That's significant in some ways, but if you're at the sort of pre-feasibility, just trying to get your head around what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, that kind of error is swamped by all kinds of other uncertainties. So over the course of those 10 years, how much is the load going to change, for example? And so I'll admit to a certain cavalier attitude about the 1% effects, or 1% a year effects. Now the truth is that they do add up. Some of them are easier to handle than others. So like the density, air density, we're gonna fix that because that's easy to fix. But the things that happen over time, it's a great convenience from a modeling perspective to model 1 year and optimize for this year. If we tried to optimize over a 25-year project life, and we did do this initially a little bit, and it's kind of intractable because, okay, so over a 25-year life, that gives you opportunities to upgrade the system. So that's a whole nother optimization. And do you optimize now knowing that you could upgrade the system in 5 years? You know, are you going to have that planning interval be 5 years or 7 years? And so we did try that initially, and it was really confusing for everybody, frankly. And so the last thing I want to do is have the model is supposed to reduce confusion. So if the model itself is confusing, so there's an awful, what nobody's mentioned, and it goes, actually I should have been putting some of this, so aging goes over here, but I'm going to put it down near the bottom, just because I think it's a hard one to deal with. There was availability. Goes over here too. The truth is, Homer doesn't handle availability well, and but it's high on the wish list. What's that one? Losses. So it handles some losses better than others.
Cogeneration?
Does handle cogeneration. So that goes over here. So
When you say you optimize for, say, a 25-year lifetime, does it mean that you allow for development in fuel prices and consumer demands and so on?
that was the other one I knew there was another one I wanted to put on here. So we do sensitivities on them now, which is partially gets you there, but we don't actually do price escalations, we'll call it, and load growth.
Yeah, so-
So sensitivity analysis gets you part of the way there, but to really do these, you'd have to think, okay, well, if the load is growing, at some point, we'll add another component. And so now instead of doing optimization over 1 year, you're doing this dynamic optimization over whatever, 25 years. The problem size expands dramatically.
But I agree, it's not necessarily a homework problem, but frequently we are in situations where people know that in this and that locality we're looking at, we know the population will grow so and so much. And then it would be very nice to be able to come in and say, we assume that the sensitivity analysis will still be very valid, but an idea, a user idea of what is developed will sometimes be very important.
Right. So we can say, the way Homer is now, we can say, okay, given today's load, here's what the system should look like. Given what the load in, say, 5 years we think it will be, here's what an optimum system would be for that load, be different, and we can compare them. We can also do an analysis that says, okay, let's say we installed the system that Homer says is optimal for today. Let's say we install that today. 5 years from now, we do another analysis. We do another analysis as if it was 5 years later. All of the stuff that we installed today is now a sunk cost, has no capital cost. Still has a replacement cost, still has fuel and O&M costs, but the capital cost is zero. We treat that as existing, and then ask Homer, okay, well, we have a bigger load now. What's additional equipment is needed? It's not quite as automated. Yeah. Well, I think we have a pretty good list, and you can always add to it. So I'm going to just jump right in and talk about what. So we call it operating reserve. You can call it spinning reserve, whatever you. It's really the same thing. But let's define what we're talking about, because I don't know. You can end half of disagreements, I find, are just people using words differently and not realizing that they're using words differently. So the way we define this is, first we define a concept we call operating capacity, and we have a constraint that says that has to be greater than or equal to the load plus the required operating reserve. So operating capacity depends on the type of source of it. So for a generator, it's the capacity of the generator. So regardless of what, it's not the output of the generator, it's the capacity of the generator. But for wind and solar, it's the output. So this is what it's capable of providing right then and there. So the wind and solar, if it's producing X, it can't produce more than X, that's what it's producing. For the generator, if it has a capacity of 200 kilowatts, but it's only producing 150, it's got another 50 kilowatts of spinning reserve. But the operating capacity is 200, even though the operating output is 150. So I'm just defining terms here. For batteries, it depends on the state of charge of the battery. So if the battery has a low state of charge, it has very little operating capacity. It's how much power could we get out of that battery in this hour if we needed to. So it depends on the state of charge. So these things vary, hour by hour. So a couple of things we don't consider. We assume if the generator's running, it's capable of ramping up to its maximum, to its rated capacity. So we're not considering ramp rates. Now, if you're thinking about hour time steps, that's I think a totally defensible assumption. When you're running Homer at a 1 minute time step, it's still, you're starting to get to where ramp rates might be important, depending on the generator. And if you're trying to use Homer to look at a coal plant, well, that's an issue. But people don't generally do that, so that's fine. So that's how I wanted to make sure it was clear what we mean by operating capacity, just so as to explain this equation up here. So that's the operating capacity part of it. The load's pretty obvious. It's what in Homer we call the primary load, right? So we also have deferrable loads, and we have excess energy. We have other loads. Excuse me. So what's the required operating reserve? That's actually what the inputs in Homer are here. It's this, and let me jump to Homer here somewhere. Where is it? I've got too much stuff open. Should have closed some of this stuff. Where is? Jeez, here we go. So I just want to make sure everybody knows how to get to that screen that I was just showing. It's under constraints here. So that's the screen I was just showing, and I'll just do it from here. So we define the required operating reserve as a function of 4 parameters. The first one is the load in the current time step. So this is what utilities normally do. They say we need to have a certain amount of spinning reserve, and it's some percentage of their load. And do we have any system operators here? Some diesel plant operators? So is this the way you think about it, as a percentage of load, or? Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
I'm not a system operator. I've been working with utilities on modeling and dealing with their spinning reserve requirements here in the rail belt, which is different than kind of the grid situation. But when they call spinning reserve, they base that on the single largest unit that's running. And so if you lose your biggest gas turbine, let's say, which is what typically it is in the rail belt, you have to have something else to pick that up instantly.
Right.
That's spinning reserve. In that terminology, that's, I think, different than what you're referring to here with what you said on an earlier screen with the diesel gen set. If you have 200 kW capacity and you're only spinning at 100, you're only putting out 150 kW, you said that you have a 50 kilowatt spinning reserve, but I think that would be a capacity reserve, but not something that's going to pick up if you lose your unit.
No, I actually think you raise a good point. For large interconnected utilities, for larger utilities, they have this N-1 contingency, where the spinning reserve is equal to their largest unit, so that if they lose that, they're okay. It's the same spinning reserve. They achieve that by having generators running at less than their full capacity, and that margin between where they're operating is their spinning reserve. But if you're not a big interconnected utility and you only have a couple of generators, if you lose one of those I don't know what happens. If you lose one of those generators, you probably have a temporary outage because it may not be practical if you only have 2 or 3 generators to have to maintain that N-1 contingency. So.
I'm not trying to add confusion. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So that 10% number there is a default, and I don't vouch for its whether that's the right number or not. That's just that's a number that the user can play with. It seemed reasonable to us, but we're more focused on the reserves as a function of the wind, actually. But it's an easy enough number for you to change. The second number is, as a function of the annual peak load. So whereas this number here can change time step by time step, this is the load in that time step, so that's sort of a dynamic number. This number is going to be constant because it's a function of the peak load. The peak load's not going to change over time. It's the annual peak load. And the reason so you could think of this as just, well, this is a certain amount of operating reserve in kilowatts. We could have specified it in kilowatts and just as easily. We didn't, because if you want to do a sensitivity on the load growth, then this will scale with the load, whereas if we did it in kilowatts, it wouldn't scale with the loads. So it's, but you should think of this as a sort of fixed number. Solar we're not going to talk about very much, but this is the key one, and a way to think about this is within the time step, whether it's 60 minutes, 15 minutes, 1 minute, whatever, within a particular time step, what's the maximum amount of wind power that we want to protect ourselves from losing? So Russell said he's seen situations where where you lose it all in 2 seconds. I'm hoping and presuming that that's an extreme example. But if that was the case, you'd want to put 100% there. If you've got, and that clearly would be the case if you had one generator and you were worried about it tripping off or overspeed protection or something. But if you have multiple generators, you might be able to get by with less than 100% there. But 100% is the most conservative. It says we've got enough spinning reserve to cover instantaneous loss of all of our wind power. So that in a way it's sort of a starting point, but it's conservative, which maybe is appropriate. Yeah.
Question on that. So if a wind turbine, for instance, cuts off at 25 meters per second, whether it's supplying power to the primary load and maybe a secondary dump load, basically by putting 100% there, you're saying one or another in the rest of the system, if it is 27 meters per second, the turbine shut off, you've lost 100% of your wind, one or another you have to have that capacity elsewhere in the system fast enough to get the diesel on or whatever.
Right.
Or whatever other resources you have in the system.
Yeah, you just have to have enough capacity to replace it. Now, if a lot of that is going towards a secondary load, that's not part of this formula.
Right, the 100% is just on the primary load. Or is it off the wind capacity that's installed?
Yeah, well, so I should have been much more clearer here to say primary load. So I'll stick that in right now.
But as the percentage of renewable output, that is not the nameplate of the renewable output. Again, that is going back and looking at the primary load. Let's say you have a 100 kW primary load, but you have 200 kW of installed capacity. Is that 100% of the 200 kW installed capacity, or is it 100% of the 100 kW primary?
It's of the wind power output. So it's neither. It's what was the wind power doing in that hour, right? But
primary or secondary?
No, this has nothing to do with primary or secondary. This is we're defining this number. These parameters here define this number here, right? So, and this is in percentage terms. So we say, what was the wind power doing in that hour? So let's say,
Whether it's going to the primary or secondary?
Doesn't matter. What's the wind power doing in that hour? And whatever percentage of that you put in here goes into this formula here. Does that make sense?
Saying that Homer is saying, look, we need 200 kW of reserve capacity, even though we've got a primary and secondary load, or is it only looking at that primary load?
Okay, so let's just work it out. Our operating capacity in that, so let's say the diesels are off, just for simplicity. So our operating capacity in that hour would be 200 kW, right? So the nameplate capacity of the wind doesn't enter into this at all. But because, in this case, it sort of does because you're saying it's operating at its maximum. Right?
It's a hybrid.
It's operating at its rated capacity. So in that sense, it does enter into it. So we're saying that's 200K is the operating capacity. We're saying that has to be greater than, so you're saying what's the primary load is 100 kW? It has to be greater than 100 kW plus X percent of, in this case, 200. So Homer would say, no, that violates the constraint, right? If X was anything greater than 50%, Homer's going to say, no, you've got a capacity shortage. You don't have enough. And it would either add more operating reserves by turning on a generator, or it would register, oh, capacity shortage, and then oh, jeez. And then we have this other parameter here that says maximum annual capacity shortage, which typically would be 0. So it tallies up the capacity shortage over the course of the year, and if it exceeds that constraint, it says, no, that system's infeasible. And it doesn't even show you the results, it just says infeasible system. Now, in the future, I think we're going to start showing those results anyway. But it's not meeting your capacity shortage constraint. But if you had a generator that you could dispatch, it would do that, and so that it would meet this constraint.
So if again, for simplicity's sake, let's say that the maximum primary load was 100 kW and it was operating at 100 kW. And I have high wind conditions, so 100 kW is going for the primary load, 100 kW is going to the secondary, which would be the thermal dump load. On this, should you put 50%? Because, I mean, how do you get it where Homer models the full availability of what the wind can put out 200 kW, but not turn on other reserve because you're saying that I have X percent on the operating reserve that I need to have. When you go from the primary load to the secondary load, really your operating reserve is part of that secondary load because you can turn it off.
Right. So I mean, it's partly the way we defined it here. Oh shoot. We actually don't have the operating reserve in the formula. We have this operating capacity, and we have the required operating reserve. I mean, that formula could be rewritten as operating capacity minus the load has to be greater than or equal to the required, let's call it. This is your spinning reserve. And you know, maybe this was an easier way for the programmer. This is algebraically equivalent, and this might be an easier way to think about it. So when you talk about operating capacity minus the load, well, in the example you gave, because it's wind providing the operating capacity, this is what's going to your secondary load. And that counts as spinning reserve, and it has to be greater than the spinning reserve requirement. If the operating capacity were being provided by diesel, it wouldn't be going to your excess, typically wouldn't be going to your secondary load. So it's a functionally equivalent. Did that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I'll follow up separately.
All right.
It doesn't work.
So this is confusing, actually. And frankly, I actually intuitively think about it easier this way, which is why I forced myself to write it down so I could try to be clear when I explain it. So just to be totally thorough about it, I think I've already mentioned this, that requiring operating reserve varies every time step. Another important point, though, is that, and Homer tracks what's on the DC bus and what's on the AC bus separately, and you can easily have, so the inverter matters. If there's a capacity constraint on the inverter, that constrains how much operating reserve you have. And the efficiency of the inverter also reduces the operating reserve if you're relying on a DC source like the batteries to provide AC operating reserve. Yeah.
Isn't 25 and 50 is the recommended values, or what is the practical observed, if anyone has observed it?
You asked if those are recommended values?
Right.
No, I don't recommend. Actually, that would be a good discussion point. I think I already mentioned 100 is the conservative number. And I actually think it's quite a controversial topic because it depends on how steady is your wind resource, how stiff is your grid, how much tolerance you have for frequency and voltage deviations on the grid. I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that question. How fast your diesels can ramp.
Could generators, for instance, have excess capacity beyond their nominal continuous capacity as well? So for a short time, they may be able to supply.
That's a good point. So inverters have a surge capacity, and diesel generators have the ability to overfire, or I'm not sure the right term for it. So probably for those.
So for short-term wind pulses, they may be able to be handled.
Or,
So that if there was that extra capacity, then the wind power there, 50% may be appropriate rather than 100%.
right. You know, that's an interesting point, which I hadn't really thought about. This is useful to me. It could be that we should be asking for surge capacity and using that for the spinning reserve.
Depending on the time duration.
Yeah.
That overload typically is 10 minutes out of an hour, so we're doing hour intervals. Maximum overload, if your generator has an overload rating, is 10 minutes.
For a diesel generator. Yeah, and for inverters, you have multiple surge. You can do bigger surges for shorter periods of time and smaller surges for larger amounts of time. So I'm not sure if this is worth the complexity that it would add to the model. I mean, it's a good point. I'm just suddenly getting a little overwhelmed by, well, this is going to add a lot of complexity. And there's always this trade-off between complexity and usability. But it's a good point.
So maybe that's where the intuition of, what feels right. If there's overload capacity there, then you're not so tight on the wind.
Right.
Not actually completely defining it and including it in the model.
Yeah, so here's what Homer can do and what it can't do. Homer cannot tell you how much operating reserve you need. Homer can tell you the cost impacts of changing that assumption about how much operating reserve you require. So, I think that's helpful. I think the stability models can go a little further in terms of telling you what happens to the system in this contingency if there's this much operating reserve with these characteristics. But how common those are is the missing piece of the analysis. So I think answering that question about how much operating reserve you need is actually a very complex, difficult question. The stability analysis models help with that. Even they don't completely answer the question. But our goal was to have something simpler that, et cetera.
Peter, what would go a long way towards being able to answer that question, or, Homer being able to answer that question? And this is sort of reminiscent of hybrid 2, is to introduce, say, standard deviation within the time step of the renewable resource and the load. And that wouldn't necessarily add a great deal of complexity. I mean, it would impose an additional data entry burden, but or you could just ignore it. But that would enable you to get at the source of much of the uncertainty.
Right. So that's a good point. That's probably belongs in our wish list of version. So it's called turbulence intensity, right? That's the standard deviation divided by the average.
Yeah, but it could be applied to the load as well.
Okay. Standard deviation of load and wind. Actually, though, there's another. That by itself isn't enough. You also need this loss of load probability, right? And that's so. Is this worth going into? Maybe. So if I understand it correctly, your suggestion is if, let's say, 8 meters per second, okay, that's what the wind, in Homer we'll say, okay, the wind is 8 meters per second in this time step. But really, over the course of that time step, whether it's a minute or an hour, we know that there's some distribution that the wind is varying within the time step. And so what Steve's suggesting is that if we ask for, right now we're just asking for the mean wind speed within the time step, but if we also ask for the standard deviation, we assume it's a normally distributed, which is within a time step is probably kind of reasonable, pretty reasonable. And we ask for the standard deviation, now we have this probability distribution. But then we have to say, okay, well, where are we cutting it off? We're saying, okay, so that means there's some probability that the wind's going to drop below this some number here, and we want to have enough, and we define the operating reserve that's required by how much this is wind speed, how much of the power output drop between here, but we also have to define the constraint here somewhere. So it does that by asking the user for a loss of load probability. How far out on the tail do you want to protect yourself? And the utility industry uses the term loss of load probability frequently in a different way, though. And so they're using the loss of load probability of over the course of a year as what's the probability of losing load over an extended time period. This is what's the probability of losing load in this one time step. So I think that would help, and it's the kind of thing that when we have a boutique model for wind diesel systems, that would probably be worth adding. I think that stuck it here on the wish list. But it doesn't do it now. So I'll move on. Okay. Anything else on operating reserve? An important issue with regard to operating reserve is the one Pierre brought up about minimum load on the diesel, because the most costly thing about your spinning reserves is when it forces you to run your diesels at low loads if you need the diesel just for operating reserve. And so if you've got a minimum load requirement on the diesel, and you have a large operating reserve requirement, you could end up running that diesel at its minimum load. And let me show. Where that is here. So here's a diesel. Actually, hold on one second. I want to just change something, so give me a second to change something here. Sorry. So this is where you enter the minimum load on the diesel, the minimum load requirement. So if Homer decides it needs that diesel for operating reserve, but it doesn't need the power for meeting the load, it would prefer to run below 30, in this case it's 30%, it would prefer to run below 30% of its rated capacity. But Homer will force it to run at 30% of its rated capacity. And now you have excess energy that's actually diesel energy. So there's this whole thing we got into about how, this is sort of a tangent. I'm going to go off on this tangent for a second. How do we define renewable fraction in Homer? So that's one of the summary outputs that is right here. And I don't like it. And the reason I don't like it is because we've gone back and forth on, well, how do we deal with excess energy in the renewable fraction? So there's one school of thought that says excess energy is always the renewables. Diesel wouldn't have excess energy, so we shouldn't give the renewables credit for any excess energy. We should subtract all the excess energy from the renewable output and then calculate renewable fraction. And that's what we're doing currently, because we got a lot of complaints about the way we used to do it, which is we just took the renewable production and divided it by the load, in which case we were sometimes giving the renewables credit for excess energy. And really, there's no best way to do this. So I actually prefer the second one. It does make renewables look better, but I think it's easier for me to get my head around. And the only reason I bring it up is because it ties into this question about what Homer will do if you need the diesel for spinning reserve, but you've got lots of wind out there. Homer will run the diesel at its minimum load, and and the other power can go to whatever you do with your excess energy, whether it's the secondary load or not. So when you set this minimum load constraint there, Homer's going to enforce that, even if it means sending diesel power to the secondary load. And I have a good example of that here. I think it's right. Well, actually, wait a second. It's probably easier to see it here. Whoops. So this is 7 days. This is an analysis we did with 1 minute time steps, actually. And we have 3 generators. And you can see, oh, I've got to get these colors right. I think, shoot. Right, so this green color is the wind turbine output here. The red is the excess energy, or we call it excess. It's probably, or we used to call it dump. That's even worse. We should probably call it secondary load, except that you may not have a secondary load, in which case it really is excess. Whatever. The power going in and out of the flywheel is here in the blue. So here's the load. You can see that we're running diesel off for significant chunks of time here. But every once in a while, the wind isn't quite enough that we actually need the generator to meet the spinning reserve requirement. So the generator comes on, and it's really flat here because that's the minimum load constraint. Whoops. Oh, shoot. I didn't mean to do that. So we have all this excess, or secondary load, or whatever, excess energy, and some of it's coming from the wind. It's impossible to distinguish where the electrons, is the power going to the secondary load? Is that diesel power or renewable power? Is it because the wind's blowing too strong, or is it because our minimum load constraint is too high? It's electrons are electrons. So the point here, though, is that the economics of wind diesel systems, there's a real interplay between the spinning reserve requirements and the minimum load on the diesel. So if you can tolerate lower loads on your diesels, it's less costly and easier to provide the operating reserve for the wind. But it's a trade-off because running your diesels at low loads has, other problems, other costs associated with it. I have a good slide, it's not in my presentation here actually, that shows this trade-off of setting a higher minimum load constraint on the diesel really hurts the wind diesel systems because it makes it more costly to meet the spinning reserve requirements. So if you have a high spinning reserve requirement and a high minimum load on the diesel, that's really hurts the economics of wind, and there's this trade-off between the two parameters. And after the break, I will try to pull up that slide. I'm afraid it's going to take me a minute of boring you to find it, but I'll look for it during the break. Yeah.
Offer a comment. I don't think the minimum load of the diesel should be deducted from the spinning reserve, because the minimum load requirement is a thermal requirement. All of that energy that load that you're requiring to keep on is available to be used to meet the packing load.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say the minimum load is deducted from the spinning reserve requirement. I just meant that setting that constraint, where you set that a constraint, affects the economics, and it does that in a way that depends upon the reserve requirements, that these two parameters interact with each other, not that you deduct the minimum load from the reserve requirement. Now I'm afraid I've really confused everybody. Actually, this is actually a pretty simple formula, although I'll admit, I have to keep reminding myself of it. But if you just go back to this formula, you can understand how Homer handles operating reserve. And it doesn't say anything about the minimum load here, but it's just that the minimum load affects the results, basically. Now, I'm really afraid I've confused everybody. But let me go to a particular example, which is this one here, where we have a 2 megawatt system. We have 3 650 kilowatt generators. This is, I need to acknowledge and thank Beacon Power for this. This is an example. We did, but we're looking, this is the Beacon flywheel. And and there's 3 existing generators, and we wanted to know how many flywheels is optimum. So first I want to just point something out, which is, since they're existing, oops, never mind, I made a mistake. So there's 3 existing wind turbines. Oh, shoot. Huh. So you can see we've put a 0 capital cost in there. We probably should have put a replacement cost for it. So this isn't perfect. But, and you can also see we're doing 1 minute time steps, so it just crunched 500,000 data points. So when you're doing 1 minute time steps, it runs a lot slower. But this is where I got those graphs I was showing earlier. And you can see it's a lot slower. So looking at the case with 3 wind turbines, we said, what happens as you add more flywheels? Well, as you add more flywheels, you can start shutting down the diesels, because the diesels are being used to a large extent just for spinning reserve. And the flywheel can provide that spinning reserve, so you can shut down the diesels. And you can see there's although it's not a nice smooth curve, you do reach a point of diminishing returns. And so their optimum is in here somewhere. So this is for the case with 3 wind turbines. And I've exported the data to Excel and graphed this graph of total net present cost as a function of the number of wind turbines. And in some ways, it'd be nice if this was a nice smooth curve, because it'd be really obvious where the optimum is. And I looked at this and I went, oh my God, what's going on? Why is this so, funny shaped of a curve? But you can see that the flywheels really help reduce costs. Something happens there where it flattens out, and you get this little bumpy thing, but then at some point, more flywheels isn't helping anymore. And so that's where this other graph here is kind of useful. And the reason that, the fact that this is not a nice smooth curve is because it's really not a linear problem. It's actually a pretty complex, there's a lot going on. And it has to do with how the wind and the load are correlated with each other. So you do get these sort of nonlinearities here, or irregular behavior, which I think is quite interesting, actually. And if I had more time, I could go into showing the load, because the load is, you have a lot of hours with loads in this range and a lot of hours with loads in this range, and the correlation between the load and the wind creates this curve. But I think this is an interesting result from a real analysis where we helped Beacon Power look at the number. flywheels, that would be optimum. The other thing that was interesting about this particular case, if I go back here, is then I went back and I said, well, wait a minute, that's with just 3 wind turbines. And so I asked Homer, well, what about, is 3 wind turbines the right number of wind turbines? Maybe they'd be better off with more wind turbines. So the optimum case here with 3 wind turbines is down here, and adding a 4th wind turbine, Homer's saying, is cost effective and would further reduce the cost of energy another percentage, from 20.8% to 19.2 cents. So 1.6 out of about 7 would create another, say, 7% reduction in the cost of energy if there is room for another wind turbine. The operating costs are going from $1.15 million per year to $1.02 million per year. So you're saving, here's operating costs, you're saving something like $130,000 a year in operating costs. And the fuel consumption is going from, I can't read this, 1.09 million to 885,000 liters per year. So that's the kind of big picture question that we like to use Homer for. Well, should we be thinking about a 4th turbine? Now, there's all kinds of other issues. Is there a siting for a 4th turbine? Is there a place to put it, et cetera, et cetera. But what I thought was interesting and a little surprising was that you add the 4th turbine, and it's the same number of of flywheels is still the optimum number of flywheels. I actually found that kind of surprising. And it's telling me down here, well, we really should consider maybe even more wind turbines. We don't know that. So I looked at 2, 3, and 4 wind turbines, and the costs went something like this. 3 is better than 2, 4 is better than 3, and Homer, this message, this error message here is actually pretty important. It's saying, well, what Homer said was optimal was the biggest number you gave it. So we don't know whether 5, if we had 5, would it be better still, or is it going to start to go up again? Because we didn't look at 5, we don't know that. Homer is giving a little, I think it's sort of an important, it was an important enough point that we put in that warning there that said, we really should look at 5. And we probably should. But I just wanted to show that warning. Okay, so we handle minimum load. We're not making it through our list very fast, but let's jump back to the list. Advanced storage options. So this is all going to change in version 3, but let me just talk about what we've done in this version, which is not in the, so this is in 2.81, it's not in 2.68, depending on which version you have. So we've created, conventional basically means lead acid batteries, but we've worked with ZBB, and we also previously worked with VRB, which is now Prudent Energy, and their batteries are different. So if you're working with a conventional battery, traditionally we had this kinetic battery model where you put in the amp hour capacity of the battery as a function of the discharge rate. So this is standard data that you can get from the battery manufacturers, and it varies quite a bit. And you enter that data here, fills out the graph. it has this thing in the background called the kinetic battery model, which I could go into detail about, calculates the parameters for it. If you don't have that data, you can use the simple model, which just says you've got so many kilowatt hours, and that energy is entirely available to you. It's actually it's sort of unrealistically favorable to the battery, but it's sort of like an ideal battery. But if you don't have the parameters, that's fine. Likewise, with the lifetime, you can often get this data from the battery manufacturers, which is, as a function of the depth of discharge, how many cycles to failure are there? And to get, whoa, I didn't mean to, hold on a second. So let me take a conventional battery here and give you an example of this. So here's where we filled out the capacity curve for the battery from so many amp hours of capacity. If you're discharging at this rate, if you're discharging at a higher rate, you get less capacity. Those are the little diamonds. And then we do a best fit of the 3 kinetic battery parameters to fit the data. Likewise, on the lifetime data, we put in cycles to failure, depth of discharge. If you multiply those 2 numbers together, you get kilowatt hour throughput. Lifetime is not in terms of number of cycles, but in terms of number of kilowatt hours of throughput. And that's the black diamonds here. And we make an assumption, to simplify things, that the kilowatt hour throughput is a constant. And in this case, it actually looks like a pretty good assumption. It varies from battery to battery how good an assumption that is. In this case, it's not bad. So we don't model mostly because I've never seen the data that would help me support this, of just how much worse is a kilowatt hour at what state of charge. Now, we all know load state of charges are very bad for batteries, but I don't have really good data about what happens when you have erratic discharge cycles, which a hybrid power system is going to have. All of the battery testing manufacturers battery manufacturer testing is done with the same cycle over and over again, repeated tests of the identical cycles. So that's an interesting research question, actually, is the impact of erratic cycles on the life of a battery. If the way we deal with low states of charge is we enforce a minimum state of charge here. Now, one of the things that we're going to change in Homer, because we've changed it, this is the way it used to be quite a while ago, we changed it and we decided we liked the old way. If you want to change the minimums, right now we treat the minimum state of charge as a property of the battery. So if you want to change the minimum state of charge, it's really an inverter setting. It's not really a property of the battery. So my apologies. For now, we're treating it as a property of the battery. If you want to change the minimum state of charge of the battery, you have to create a new battery that's identical to the other battery, except you can change this one parameter. So I should perhaps show you how you do that. Go into New, give it a name. Wait a minute, just a second here. Actually, we go into, let's say we take copy. Okay, this is identical. We'll change it to, instead of that name, we're going to give it this name, but we're going to call it a 40% SOC. And then we change this to 40, and we've just created, it's identical to the old battery, it's just that it has a 40% minimum state of charge instead of a 30%. It's a new entry in the library, right there. I think this is kind of awkward. In version 3, we're going to make it easier to do that, frankly. For the ZBB, let's say, for example, there's several things that we don't worry about. And frankly, I'm having trouble remembering what they are. This maximum charge rate, for example, goes away. That's amps per amp hour of headroom. That's a way to, when you're charging a lead acid battery, you have to approach 100% state of charge sort of asymptotically. You have to slow down the charge rate as you near the top, and it gets less efficient at that point. So this is how that parameter is in there because of the behavior of lead acid batteries. So for the ZBB, we don't have that. Likewise, on storage, it doesn't need the kinetic battery model. You can put, correct me if I'm wrong, you can put as much charge into it as you want for its entire right. Yeah. So it has the same abilities to accept and reject charge throughout its whole state of charge range. Right. And likewise, its lifetime is a function of shelf life, not cycle life, approximately. So, well, that's the assumption we've made.
So there are a few batteries, such as this ZBB, that you have specific operating performance parameters in there. Perhaps over time, with other batteries emerging on the market, you would imagine you'd have more options there, for example, but other than that, they're sort of a standard default. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so maintaining databases of component databases is costly. And so we recognize our users really want it, but we don't really know how to do a good job, how to maintain it in a cost-effective way. So we're open for suggestions on how to maintain that. One way is we have a community site. It's not, when we have, within our community site, we have a special section just for Alaska. But I will admit, frankly, that our community site needs a little work to meet the potential that it has for users to share things like, I created a new battery, why don't I let everybody else use it? So we need a place. My vision for our community site is that would be a place where people could share and help maintain sort of a user-generated database of components. Because I don't think we're going to be capable of being truly comprehensive. So we've created a library that has a lot of batteries in it, and if a battery manufacturer wants us to add their stuff to it, we're happy to do that, but we're not going to claim it's comprehensive because there's too many batteries out there. Likewise with wind turbines as well. Although theoretically, there aren't as many wind turbines as there are batteries, so we should be able to do a better job with that. It's still a lot of work to maintain that database. So where to?
Before we go any further, do you have any calculations? We talked about degradation. Do you have anything for aux power requirements?
I'm sorry, for what?
Auxiliary power requirements, environmental, life-sustaining things for the energy storage in there. They can be significant, particularly in warmer climates. Maybe it's difficult, but.
Right. So, if I remember correctly, under Flywheel. Okay, so actually, here's an important point that, again, we're going to hopefully fix this in version 3. But first, we started working with PowerCorp, which has this flywheel that's got 30 seconds worth of storage in it. So that in Homer, that flywheel is simply a source of operating reserve. So let me just show you what it looks like here. Because 30 seconds, even if you ran Homer at the 1 minute time step, we can't track the state of charge, if you call it state of charge, of a flywheel with 30 seconds of storage in it. So we don't try to track this. So this component here, let me back up a little bit. Under add remove, where it says flywheel here, this is really the PowerCorp flywheel, or any flywheel like that that's less than a minute of energy. And all it does is say, how much does it cost? What's its capacity? And that capacity is available simply for operating reserve. It's just a source of operating reserve. How long is it going to last? But it does have a parasitic load. And then your flywheel probably should have a parasitic load, but I'm not sure it does, to be honest with you. So that's not fair.
It shows up in the round trip efficiency. 85%, I think.
Actually, not yours, the beacon. Sorry, I'm kidding. Well, no, that's the round trip efficiency, because the parasitic load is there even if no energy is going in and out, right? So the round trip efficiency is how much of the energy that went in can you get out? So I mean, you could think of it it's in a way there are two different kinds of losses. One's a function of time, and one's a function of throughput. And we should have a parasitic load in there, but we don't. So we should add it. So what I'm hoping for version 3 is we have one component that's called electric storage, and it includes all the different battery types, and it includes all the different flywheel types, and it's all in one place, and it's a little simpler. But because of the way this evolved over time, first we created a flywheel where it didn't make sense to treat it like a battery, where we track the state of charge. And then we started working with Beacon, where they did want us to do that, so we had to do it two different ways. So I think that's it for storage options. Yes, Steve?
So when you are trying to track state of charge and model the actual energy flow in and out of the battery, you always then choose a time step that's well below the scale of storage that time scale of storage that you're looking at.
Yeah. Well, you need to. You should. That's a good point. That would be good modeling. You'd get silly results if you didn't do that.
Unless you treat it like you treated the power cord, which is just a source of
right.
power. And you can do that for an hour time step.
Right. Right. So it's important also to recognize that Homer is going to underestimate the actual throughput in the battery because it's not looking at power that's going in and out of the battery within a time step. That's a pretty important point. Right. So I'm trying to be honest about what Homer doesn't do as well. Actually, in a way, I think that's what defines a model. My analogy that I really like is a map is a model of the world. If it had all the detail of the world, it would be the size of the world, and it would be useless. So I like that analogy. So let me go back to my list. We're getting close to break, but we can keep going a little bit. Diesel maintenance. So here's how Homer deals with diesel maintenance right now. First of all, on the availability question, it doesn't deal with that. Again, that's something that's actually probably not going to show up in version 3, but it's a high priority for version 4. We just need to get some funding to do that. We have National Science Foundation funding for version 3, but we don't really have funding for this piece. So all these enhancements we want to make to Homer are really a function of funding. But let me talk about diesel maintenance for a second. Every component has a maintenance field. For things like PV and wind turbines and inverters, it's dollars per year. And the way the cost table works is whatever row you're on in the cost table, this is $4.50 for this size. If we had different sizes, it's not per, it's there's a reason these are all in a row. But for diesels, it's dollars per operating hour, which is the way costs for diesel actually are incurred. You see studies where they talk about the O&M costs of different generating technologies in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. But that's, maybe convenient for the analyst writing that white paper or something, but it's really not the way costs for a diesel generator actually are incurred. So when you see something like the maintenance cost for diesel is 3 cents a kilowatt hour, let's say. Well, there's implied within that some capacity factor because just to take an overly simple example, if you have to spend dollars and interval, if you have to spend $300 every 10,000 hours, that's equal to 3 cents an operating hour, right? Wait. Excuse me a second. Let's say you've got a 100 kilowatt generator. And you have to spend $300 on an oil change. Oil change, filters change, et cetera. It's going to cost $300. You have to do it every 100 operating hours. I'm just making up these numbers. That would be $3 per operating hour. So that would be the number to put into Homer. If you wanted to convert that to cents per kilowatt hour, well, how many kilowatt hours are you going to produce in these 100 hours? If you're operating at full capacity, that'd be 10,000 kilowatt hours, that would be 3 cents a kilowatt hour. But you're not going to be operating, but you don't at 100 kilowatts the whole time. So how do you calculate cents per kilowatt hour? I mean, one of the biggest issues with wind diesel is unless you've got other sources of operating a spinning reserve, unless you have a way of turning off generators or using a smaller generator instead of a larger generator, you put wind on the system, you're just pushing the generators down to a lower operating level, operating them less efficiently, and you're not reducing your maintenance costs at all. So if using this so many cents per kilowatt hour, either on the maintenance side or on the fuel side, is like the beginner's mistake on the economics of wind diesel. Unless you can turn off the generators, you're not going to get that savings. So it's actually a really important point that you need to think about the maintenance in terms of operating hours. That's actually pretty obvious. Both of these things feel pretty obvious to me, but they're not until you think about it a little bit. Anyway, I'm sort of stressing this point, and maybe I don't need to. The maintenance costs are a function of operating hours. So that's what I think Homer does really well. It does it in terms of operating hours. That's really good. What it doesn't do very well, and we're going to this one we definitely are going to fix, is how to handle overhaul costs. So this approach that we've got here is probably really good for small diesels, where you've got this number here that covers your regular maintenance, your oil changes and filter changes, et cetera, which have to happen, every 100 hours or every couple hundred hours, something like that. And then you have a lifetime here, and at the end of that lifetime, you replace the generator, and it costs you this much. So you have regular maintenance here, so many dollars per operating hour. Oh no, I'm sorry, right here. So many dollars per operating hour. And then this many dollars to replace it at the end of its lifetime. Well, that's fine for small generators, but for large generators, instead of throwing it away at the end of X number of hours, you overhaul it. And you can overhaul it over and over and over again. And so there's two ways to handle that. You can either take that overhaul cost, divide it by the overhaul interval, and add that in here to the O&M costs, in which case this lifetime here ends up being, well, how many times can you overhaul it? Then in that case, this should be a pretty big number, because it's not the overhaul interval, it's when you really are done, can't overhaul it anymore. Or you can say, no, let's make this the overhaul cost and this the overhaul interval. And you can do it either way. If you do it the second way, you're basically saying, we can just overhaul this thing indefinitely, which isn't quite right, but in reality what happens is you get a new generator and you keep the old one, and you don't necessarily throw it away, you just sort of stop using it. And so if that's the case, then the second approach is maybe the better approach. So this belongs in the advanced topics section, because it's a little bit of a workaround. And what we want to do in the future is actually have a little spreadsheet, sort of like I've created here, where you've got, let me make a nicer one though, where you have a field here that you say lubes, and you have another field that says minor overhaul, and major overhaul. And then you have dollars and interval. And we'll let the user create as many rows as he wants, give him whatever label he wants, and add it all up, give the user a little more flexibility about it. But in the meantime, I wanted to show you this workaround that we've created for diesel maintenance. Because that actually was motivated by conversations I've had up here in Alaska with people. Start talking about minor overhauls and major overhauls, and we can't really handle that as well as we'd like to. So it's getting close to break time. Let me see if there's a small topic. Yeah, advanced wind resource parameters is a small topic, and then we can take a break. So the best way to input wind data into Homer is if you've got a file of measured data, which is what we did here under import time series data into import time series data file. And here's the name of our data file. That's just the name of it. And pretty steady wind wherever this was. This is incredible. I know where this is. This is a tropical trade wind regime. This is actually an incredibly steady, now that I look at it, it's sort of unrealistically steady wind resource. Well, I shouldn't say unrealistically, but unusually. That's what I mean. Not huge, 6.987 meters per second. It's pretty good. So let's talk about the, and then if you import the data, Homer will estimate, will calculate these parameters. So this was a trade wind regime. A Weibull K of 3.72 is really exceptionally steady wind. You can see there's almost basically no seasonal variability. Autocorrelation 9.56 is exceptionally stable. It's got 1 minute time steps, so you'd expect the autocorrelation to be higher for short time steps than for longer time steps. And then it also calculates the diurnal pattern strength. So most places are maybe less so up in Alaska and less so in the middle of the ocean, but if you're right on coastal locations in particular, where there's a sea breeze, that's a very diurnal pattern. Most places have a diurnal pattern. So what Homer does is it tries to fit a sine wave with a 1 day period to the data, and it says, and the strength is the amplitude of that sine wave, and the hour of peak wind speed is just the point where it's at its highest point. So you import data, Homer calculates these parameters for you. If you don't have data to import, let me start fresh here. If you don't, so you can get seasonal data from there's lots of websites that'll give you monthly averages over the course of the year. The problem with the data that you find on the web, I use weatherbase.com, is it's airport data. It's from a 10-meter high anemometer. It's probably not above the trees. It's the magnitude of the magnitudes are going to be off. They're not. But the implications for your storage requirements are radically different. So this would have a very, extreme. This is sort of an extreme example, but this would have an autocorrelation of basically 1, almost perfect autocorrelation. There's just 1 hour of the year where it changes, and this would have a much lower autocorrelation. And you can see it obviously has a big impact on the storage requirement. So the autocorrelation isn't something that the wind farms care about because they're not doing storage. So the wind resource assessment world doesn't talk about autocorrelations very much. But for what we're doing, if you didn't talk about the autocorrelation, you wouldn't be able to model the value of storage very effectively. So this is all in the help file, and let me just go into this a little bit here. So I really recommend you using the help file. The formulas for autocorrelation are kind of complicated, but what we did is we took this huge table of data for I think 200 all the TMY data, the typical meteorological year data. There's 237 sites around the country, and so and we calculated these parameters for all of those sites, and that's what. And so then we have a then we can show the distribution of this parameter for all those 237 sites. So autocorrelation isn't necessarily something anyone has a lot of intuition about. I don't know. You ask me what I think your weight is. I can make a guess within 10, 15 pounds or something. But if you ask me what the autocorrelation is, I don't have, we don't have any intuition about that. But so I think this is really helpful. You can see they're mostly around 0.9. So really, this is probably Hawaii out here where it's nice trade winds, really steady. This, I happen to know, is in Colorado where it's really complex terrain and very fluky winds. So numbers down here in the 0.8 range that's a tip about as low as it goes. 0.95 is really good. And we have graphs like this for all of them. So under Weibull K, we have a similar graph here. And the default is the Rayleigh distribution, which is a Weibull K of 2. And you can see, based on that database that we used, that's a pretty good estimate. That if you didn't know anything, 2 is a good estimate. If you happen to know the winds are fluky, you might pick a slightly smaller number. If you think they're steadier than average, you might pick a slightly higher number. And just to show you for the other parameters. Diurnal pattern strength is interesting because as you go higher, it obviously gets more stable, but it actually, the diurnal pattern shifts. So, you should look at the help file. Anyway, so here's the sort of the range of numbers. There's a few places out here. These are probably places with sea breezes, which are a really pronounced diurnal pattern, where the sun comes up, heats the ground, creates an afternoon wind. Anyway, somebody asked about adjusting for the wind turbine. There's 2 ways we adjust for the wind turbine, then we'll break. One is we do an adjustment for height above ground, right here. So the wind resource, so we ask for the anemometer height here. So the data that you're putting in is for the resource at that height. And then we increase it based upon shear calculations. You can either use a logarithmic shear calculation using these surface roughness or you can do a power law. That's 0.14 is the 1/7 power law, which is a common default. Actually, wind shear is a pretty fluky concept. It's not really nearly so smooth a function. But you can see here where we say it's 6 meters per second at 10 meters above ground. As you go to higher heights above ground, it shows how that Homer changes the assumption. And just to show you, you make the parameter smaller and I just reduced the shear. So that's the shear. We also have altitude here. So somebody asked about how would you, we really should have temperature. We ask for temperature and use it to correct the efficiency of the PV, and we should do that for the wind as well. But we don't in this version, we will in the next version, but you can do your own calculation and adjust the altitude, because that has the same effect. It's just the air density. So that's slightly, I couldn't give off the top of my head tell you exactly what the formula is, but you figure out the air density. You could do that. The other adjustment we do, so here's the hub height. So the shear factor uses those 2 parameters, the anemometer height and the hub height together, to adjust for the changing the wind, the increasing the wind as you go to higher heights. If you wanted to do something like degradation of the wind turbine, what you'd have to do is create a new wind turbine with a lower power curve. Okay, it's a good time to take a break. I think so. I suppose that there's food out there, so we should show back up a little after 4. If I haven't scared you all the way. Okay, well, I'm gonna get started again, and I got a request to jump into the model and show some results, so that's what I'm gonna do. But before I do, I meant to mention this, and I want to thank Maura for reminding me. First, I'm going to apologize. This needs work as well. We need to clean it up a little bit, but we have a user group community at this site, and here's the URL up here: homerusersgroup.ning.com, and within it, we have a group, the Alaska Wind Diesel Applications. This would be a place to share experiences with wind diesels, and particularly with modeling them. So homerusersgroup.ning.com. You can actually get to it pretty easily from our main site, which you've all been to if you've downloaded Homer. Wow, this is slow. Wow. Well, you can get to it from our main site. So let me jump into some results. First thing I wanted, well, let's see. So this is an analysis I did in Molokai. And it's a 6.5 megawatt peak load. It's got an excellent wind resource, 11 meters per second. It's really excellent wind resource. So that's maybe not very representative, but it's. But at the time, this is several years old, I was using 35 cents a liter as the fuel price. So this is kind of an older analysis. But right now, they're burning 11.5 million liters per year of fuel. And we put in and we modeled the 1.5 megawatt GE turbine. Yeah?
Is this just for the island of Molokai, or are you?
Yeah, just for the island of Molokai. So I wasn't looking at any undersea cables,
Okay.
which I know they're looking at now. This is actually not a very recent analysis, but it was just an easy one I could come up with that shows some really substantial fuel savings. Those 4 turbines bring you from 11.5 million liters down to 3 million liters a year. And that's without turning off the diesels at all. That's at 100%. That's at that conservative operating reserve, 100% of the wind. So the wind doesn't allow you to reduce diesel runtime at all. So earlier, this was the file I was looking for when I said that I had a good example of how the operating reserve interacts with the minimum load on the diesel. And so what this graph is showing is the optimum number of wind turbines as a function of the operating reserve requirement and the minimum load requirement. And so if you allow the diesel to run at very low loads, the operating reserve doesn't matter, right? So it doesn't matter much. So it doesn't affect the optimum number of wind turbines, which is 4. But if you set a high, or not even that high, 20-30% minimum load on the diesel, which is not very high actually, but that really affects the economics of the wind, and it affects and now the operating reserve requirement really matters, because so 2 things are going on here. One is that increasing the minimum load on the diesel makes the diesel less cost effective. So at low reserve requirements, it's actually increasing the optimum number of wind turbines simply because it's making the diesels less attractive. And at high operating reserve requirements, you have that problem I was talking about before, where the only way to achieve those higher operating reserves is to run the diesels, but you don't really need the power, so therefore you are throwing away more power. And so the optimum number of wind turbines drops to 3. So actually I should do it this way, where we can superimpose the values. So here it's 4, up here it's 3, and down here it's 6. So I think this is kind of takes a little bit of thinking to get your head around, but this is what makes modeling valuable, I think, is it forces you to think a little bit and understand how the minimum loading, this issue about you're adding wind to the system, which is displacing diesel power, but you still need the diesel capacity for spinning reserve, there's a conflict there. And why things like flywheels and storage become really valuable as a way to provide that operating reserve without running your diesels at very low loads. So that was this example I wanted to show. Another example that I was working with, I want to thank Cord for this. So this is St. George, Alaska. And so let me just walk through what we've got here. We've got an existing generator. Whoops, that's not it. Wait a minute. Which one's the...
The first two are existing.
The first two are existing? Okay, so I should have taken the capital cost out. Well, what? I'll just do that right now. So because it's existing, it shouldn't have a capital cost in there. But we want the replacement cost because we want to account for the wear on the diesel. And the replacement, so what we're saying is after 15,000 hours, we're going to need to spend $256,000 to replace this 256 kilowatt generator. And we had, did we use the fuel curve calculator? So we calculated the fuel curve by entering in here the full load fuel consumption and the part load fuel consumption. So that one's existing, and you said this one's existing also, right? So we should do that. And then let's look at the entire search space. Because those two are existing, we're forcing them in. We're not allowing, we don't have a zero there. But then we're looking at adding, well, okay, so these are the two existing generators. They're both, well, this one is sized a little bit bigger than the peak load, probably not enough to cover spinning reserve. And this one is quite a bit bigger than the peak load. So we wanted to imagine, well, what would happen if we put in smaller wind turbines? Smaller generators, excuse me. So our choices that we're giving it are, how many wind turbines are cost effective, and would it make sense to add these smaller generators, and then how many flywheels? We are also, here under thermal load, assuming a cogeneration facility with obviously a higher thermal load in the winter, obviously. Although I'm kind of curious, Cord, this struck me that the thermal load is higher in March than in January, but there's probably a reason for that, right?
The 30-year climate data showed that yes, the highest demand of heating degree days was in the February-March timeframe.
Really? Okay. So that's just, so is this thermal load calculated based upon meteorological data or on some kind of boiler fuel measurement?
The local site data was not especially helpful, and so it was taking, at least on this preliminary one, the annual use of heating fuel or the fuel that we thought was allocated to heating, and then looking at the heating degree days on a 30-year average, and allocating that annual amount of fuel kind of across the community based upon those heating degree profiles. And that, I guess part of it was that when you buy fuel doesn't necessarily mean when you're using fuel. So
right.
Even getting the fuel data from when it was actually delivered doesn't necessarily mean when it loads. And so as a guesstimate, it was, well, let's just go with whatever the 30-year average of heating degree days is.
Right. No, that sounds totally reasonable. And even, you said the fuel use we thought was allocated. So they deliver a certain amount of fuel, but you actually don't have a good way of knowing how much of it went where.
Records on island, leave something to be desired.
Right. And so that's why we do sensitivity analysis. So it might make sense to do a sensitivity analysis here on the annual average, on the scale, that just scales it. And then, so just as an example, just to show you how this works, let's say you think, well, maybe I underestimated, or overestimated, excuse me. Are those thousands?
Kilowatt hours per day.
Yeah, I just can't see very well. Maybe I overestimated or maybe I underestimated, right? But then you go, well, wait a second. If that fuel wasn't used for thermal, maybe it went to the generator instead. Do you know how much fuel was used on? No.
Have a better idea of what went to the generators, but it might have ended up in someone's boat, or might have ended up in someone's truck.
Yeah.
Or a piece of heavy equipment. Really,
Right.
I guess we know how much came on island. We kind of know how much went to the diesel generators. You make an assumption of, well, maybe 10% went to boats and trucks and
Right.
other
Sure.
things, and so.
Sure. So that's why we have sensitivity analysis, because for exactly something like that where we don't really know, we have an estimate and there's some range around that estimate, and will it make a difference? It's not, I don't know. You know, it might and it might not. We just have to run the model and see. But now that I think about it, I'm not going to run it in real time with you all waiting to see the results. Under system control here, it says allow excess electricity to serve the thermal load. So if we turn that off, it got rid of the dump load. So we have a thermal load. Homer sticks in a boiler. This isn't very interesting because it's just going to meet the thermal load with the boiler. It always assumes that there's a boiler. Homer doesn't allow you to have unserved thermal load. It puts in a boiler and makes sure the boiler is big enough. It assumes that you can meet your thermal load, but it uses the boiler efficiency and fuel to calculate the value of the electricity that's displacing the boiler fuel. And you can either meet that thermal load with the boiler, the excess electricity, or if any one of these generators had a heat recovery on it. So somebody asked about cogeneration. If you put any number other than 0 in here, so let's say 50% of the waste heat from the generator can go to meet the thermal load, it does that. It connects it, and it calculates how much waste heat is generated by the generator, and 50% of that is available to meet the thermal load. And there very frequently will be excess thermal energy, and that's sort of normal. Couldn't find homerenergy.com. There we are. So just to show you how to get to the user group, you can get to it from our own website. There it is. So when I get a file like this, one of the first things I do is I look at the search space here and to see, well, what are we looking at? You know, what's the question that's trying to be answered? And in this case, it's how many wind turbines and how many flywheels, and whether or not it makes sense to put in a smaller generators. And we're doing a sensitivity on the operating reserve because that. So let's look at that first. So I expanded the space a little bit, and I said, let's look at operating reserve requirements all the way from 20%, which is pretty aggressive, all the way up to 100%. And it makes a big difference. At even at 100% operating reserve, 3 wind turbines are still cost effective. And to look at that case in more detail, we can double click on there, or we can just go up here between sensitivity results and operating results and find the case that we want to look at. But at 100%, the status, the current situation is should be the one with 0 capital cost, I would think. Oh, but I didn't rerun it, so it's going to be the one. I'm sorry, I took the capital costs away, but because I didn't, it's going to take me 16 minutes to run it, so I'm not going to run it. It's giving me this warning that says these outputs don't correspond to the inputs, but the only difference is the capital cost that I removed.
Just the one with the 2 generators and no battery.
Right here,
That's probably
642. Well, the way to tell is to 380,000 plus 262,000 is 642, right? Yeah. So this is the base case, and the base case is using which fuel is which. So let's see, the boiler is using diesel, and the generators are using copy of diesel. So what Core did, which is really handy, we only have one fuel, but we want to be able to easily track how much of that fuel is going to the boiler and how much of it's going to the generators. So we created a new, or Core created a new fuel. It's identical. It just has a different label, and therefore we can see this is the boiler fuel and this is the generator fuel. So 275,000 liters a year of generator fuel and 188,000 liters a year of boiler fuel. And in our optimal case, the generator fuel has gone down to 62,000. Let me write those numbers down. So 62,175 for the, which one is that? That's the generator. And the boiler is 127.48. 127.48. Is everyone visible there, or?
no.
It's the one with 2 generators and no, it's that one, right? And so those numbers are 188,828. And 275. So it's saving something like 2/3 of the generator fuel, and I don't know what that is, 60% of the boiler fuel. So it's saving about 70% of the generator fuel and 60% of the boiler fuel. So that's pretty impressive. And that's with the operating reserve set at 100%. Now if we go,
That's adding 1 turbine?
3 turbines,
Oh, 3 turbines.
which is right here.
And an electric boiler.
3 turbines, an electric boiler, 6 flywheels. So let's come over here. This is a better way to look at it. So at 100% operating reserve requirement, we need 6 flywheels. If we lower the operating reserve requirement, we need fewer flywheels. We can also And then there's this interaction with the generators as well. So at very low operating reserve requirements, instead of flywheels, we use the generators for the operating reserve. We also put in these warnings here because the red warning is saying you don't have anything in here, like you don't have anything for stability. There's no storage. Now there might be Homer's not going to model a synchronous condenser, but you're going to need something like that, and there's nothing in here for that. The yellow means, okay, you've got some storage, but your instantaneous penetration is high enough that you really need to do some dynamic stability modeling with one of the more detailed models. If you come in here and look on the electrical tab, it's showing, now the guy from Power Corp said, how do you have more than 100% renewable penetration? Well, it depends how you define. This is instantaneous penetration, and I liked Steve's definition, which is in that time step, the renewable production divided by the load, the primary load in that time step. And there's 8,760 time steps, and we just look at the highest number. So there was some hour in the year when the winds were putting out 5 times as much power as the load, which sounds like a lot, but you just need to have a place to put that power. And you can see on an annual basis, the wind turbines are producing 86% of the total production. And you can see it by month. There's quite a bit of excess energy on an annual basis. On the boiler side, this is where the boiler is using 117,000 liters per year. Wait a second. That's not what I wanted to show. This here. So the gray area here is the excess electricity, right? That's that power coming from the wind turbine, and then this is the boiler fuel here. So in March, the boiler is producing a lot of power, a lot of heat. These warnings, and something worth showing you here under File Preferences, sort of something for advanced users, but those warnings are generated by this section here. We say, I'm not in a position to say what level of renewable penetration is high enough to require you to have stability, to provide other equipment for stability purposes. So we made it an input parameter. The default's 55%, maximum instantaneous penetration. But you also need to have, if you have enough battery, that counts.
So Peter, in this case, the time interval was 1 hour. If we were to change that to 15 minutes to really, say, correctly model the flywheel, would that automatically change to 15 minutes, or would that still stay 1 hour?
No, you'd need to come in here and change this yourself. But this is, all this is doing is determining when the little warnings here come up. But it's worth noting that Homer's not doing a stability analysis. So the best it can do is give you a little warning like this and say, you should do a stability analysis. So those numbers there were based on 100% operating reserve. If we take a number more conservative, let's see, let's say 80%, that's still pretty, I mean less conservative, but actually 80% is still fairly conservative. What did that do to our fuel savings? Actually, we can see it right here. So you can see that as you become less conservative in the operating reserve, it saves you fuel. Not a tremendous amount, but it also reduces the number of flywheels you need to provide that operating reserve. And the other thing it does is over here, it reduces, well, there's two things going on. It reduces the amount of spinning reserve you need. That's provided by a combination of the flywheel and the generators. So it reduces the number of flywheels, but it increases the use of the generators. So the generators are on for more hours, but they are producing less fuel. So if you wanted to look at that more closely, what you'd find, which generator is that? The JD58. So the average electric load here is 22.4 kilowatts. As we reduce the operating reserve, it's going to run for more hours, but actually at a lower load level, 21 kilowatts. The efficiency is actually going down. So you go, well, that's bad. And so it's all a bunch of trade-offs. So here it's gone down even more. So it's bad for the diesel, but it's better for other parts of the system. How do those two trade offs? Well, sometimes it'll trade off one way and sometimes it'll trade off another way. It's not clear without doing the modeling that in this case, what you're saving from needing fewer flywheels is more than compensates for the reduced efficiency on the diesel, assuming that 80% operating reserve is adequate. So there's a lot going on. It's a lot more than you could try to get your head around intuitively or even with an Excel spreadsheet. That's why we created Homer. And it's, so even though we're not doing the stability modeling within Homer, it's still complicated and it's a lot to get your head around. So that's why it's really useful to have different models for different purposes. Because if we try to do everything in one model, it'd be pretty complicated. It'd be maybe impossible to get your head around.
Say here you can build a fuel, in other words, ultra low sulfur versus DS.
Yes. So let me show you how to do that. And that's a really good question, actually, because it's not totally obvious. The fuels are down here, and here's where you can change the price of the fuel. So we were assuming $1 a liter. And we can also tell Homer, add a constraint here that says, design me the least cost system that uses no more than X amount of fuel. And we could do a sensitivity on that. But that wasn't the question. Here's the properties of that fuel in metric, something else we're going to change in version 3. But to create a new fuel, you go into the generator that's going to use that fuel, and you go to the fuel tab of it, and this is where you create a new fuel. So here's the details, the parameters of that particular fuel. But if you want to create a new fuel, click on the New button. The part you have to remember is that to get to it, it's on the fuel tab of the generator input, because more than because my programmer had a good reason for doing that, and when he explains it to me, I go, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, but it doesn't make enough sense for me to ever remember what his reason was for doing that. It is counterintuitive. It does seem like it should be down here where the fuel is. And I always challenge him on it, and he always explains it to me, and I go, oh yeah, okay. And then I forget what that was. But anyway, that's where it is. What it does by default is it takes the existing parameters, renames it copy of X, which is probably not the best name for it. You'd probably come up with a better name. Like you wanted low sulfur. What would
ULSD, multiple sulfur diesel.
ULSD. So we could just call it ULS. Whoops, shoot, shouldn't have done that. So I'm going to delete that one. If you delete this, yes, because I didn't want to hit enter. I wanted to actually. So is the only difference going to be the sulfur content, or is it going to affect the energy content? Yeah. So you just put in the new parameters here, which I don't know if you happen to have them in the metric, I could do that for you. But you can see how you do it. You have to calculate, figure out, and you just put them in here. Whatever units you put here is what's going to show up over here. Oops. Over here as dollars per liter. And it's going to show up in the fuel curve calculator as well. And while you're asking about sulfur, by affecting the energy content, it's going to affect obviously the efficiency and the fuel consumption, etc. But it's also going to affect the sulfur emissions. So, so every fuel has emissions, you can put limits on the amount of the emissions and do a sensitivity on that. And I have a good slide that's worth diverting here for a minute to show you this. Whoops. Shoot, wrong slide. Hold on, sorry. So here's we did a Homer analysis where we took a particular site. We said, design us our least cost system. That system had 15 metric tons a year of carbon emissions. And then we said, okay, we went to that page I was just on and said, okay, design me the least cost system that emits no more than 10 metric tons per year, 5, 2.5, 1, okay, design me a 100% renewable system that uses no fuel at all. And you can see this is pretty sharply curved. And I think it's a very useful result because this debate about climate change is dominated by these two extremes. You know, one side says it's too costly, we can't do anything about it. And the other side says, no, we want it 100% renewable. We don't want to use any fossil fuels at all. Well, the people arguing for the 100% renewable scenario are actually just giving ammunition to the folks who are saying, no, it's too costly to do anything at all. This is getting that last little bit of diesel out of the picture is prohibitively expensive, really. So a graph like this demonstrates that, I think, very well, that these two endpoints are really clearly not optimal. There's a legitimate debate about where in this mid-range here is optimal. And it's a much more reasonable argument to be having over, oh, well, do we use 3 wind turbines or 4? You know, not 0 versus 100% renewable. And without a graph like this, the argument, the debate just is sort of uncentered, polarized, and not very helpful. So the way to get a graph like that is to put a constraint on carbon dioxide and do a sensitivity on that constraint. That's how I created that graph. Does that make sense? So I've worked my way through that list. Let me go back to the list. Well, not entirely, but I'd like to just throw it out to you all. What else should we be talking about? Something else on the list? Something I haven't talked about? Show some more results. If you have a homework file that you've been using and want me to look at that in more detail, what would be useful?
The way you import large data sets?
Right. Okay. Oops. Let me get rid of that. So there's 3 kinds of data sets that we can enter. Well, chronological data sets. Solar resource, not that, all right, we won't go into that. It's very similar. The wind resource data and the load data. So let's go to wind resource first. I mentioned this earlier about you can use this data generator here if all you have is monthly averages, or you can import, and if you import it, you just have to find the right file. The format, and then on the help section, it talks about what that file needs to look like. Somewhere down here. Probably the best place to, sometimes we have a search capability. So if we go import, where did we go? So we have some suggestions on where to find the data, and so let me talk about the format. It takes a text file with 1 line per data point. So if Homer sees 8,760 data points, it knows that's a hourly data file. If it sees twice that many data points, then it assumes it's a 30-minute data set. So it tries to calculate what the size of what the time step is. Let me see if I can find a data set here. These are probably all hourly data sets, but let me just see. Yeah, so it said it was 60 minutes. I have somewhere a data set that's different than that.
So do you import it as a doc file or as a text file?
Text file. So it should be just a flat text file, but you should rename it, give it the extension WND for wind or DMD for demand. Give me a second to remember where are the projects. Well, I'm not going to be able to remember off the top of my head where I had data that was a different time step. But Homer attempts to figure out what your time step is. Now, if you only have 1 month of data, then you will probably have to do what I think you did do, which was replicate it, right? Isn't that what you did? You just...
Or scaled it after, but I guess I actually have 1 year of data directly from the NRG data logger, but it's a huge amount of data. On the heat load, I guess I scaled off of what the 30-year climate data was.
Well, I'm trying to remember now which data set it was where I thought you took 1 week and just repeated it. Or maybe I'm confusing you with you. Right, okay. So I've got that file here, I think. Yeah, this one here. Right.
Or can you take the monthly data and by increasing steps or just saying, hey, I want this on 15-minute steps, will Homer automatically convert hourly to 15 minutes?
Homer can take 2 data sets that are different time steps and model that. And it will, because you, if you're modeling with simulation time steps of 60 minutes, but you have 10-minute data, it averages the 10-minute data over the 60-minute period. So that's kind of a waste, but it can do it. If you are modeling, let's say you have 10-minute wind data and 15-minute load data, and you want to do a 10-minute load step, it chops and averages the data correctly for you. But you probably, well, depends what you're trying to do, whether you want to use the shorter time steps, takes longer to run, but it's probably more accurate. So what I wanted to show was, I think this is the example where, yeah. So the STEAM app is showing an entire year's worth of data. This happens to be 1 minute data for an entire year. So and each of those little dots is an hour, or no, a minute, excuse me. And the reason it has this pattern here is because it's pretty hard to get 1 minute data for an entire year. So Beacon had 1 minute data for a week, and they just replicated it. So every week is the same, which is the problem with 1 minute data, frankly. But it's all about trade-offs. This mouse suddenly just isn't. Let's see if this helps. Not really. So, because we're replicating, this is showing the data for 1 week. So it's got some nice variation in there. Because we're using the same data, no, it's not exactly the same. Huh. That's interesting. But it's very similar. It's the same pattern week after week. So here you can see we imported the data, and Homer said, "Oh, that's what you had 500,000. You had a file with 500,000 rows in it."
Yeah, I stitched together 525,600 entries, whether it be a 1 week data, 2 week data, and I just replicated it until I got 500,000 data points.
So was it you had 2 weeks of data?
It's either 1 week or two. I can't recall.
Oh, okay. Did you do that in Excel? Because I was trying to remember yesterday.
Yeah, I did it in Excel.
So Excel will handle 525,000 rows?
Yeah, I think.
I couldn't
I'm not
remember.
sure which version of Excel you have, but
Somebody asked me that last night, and I was like, I don't. So Excel will, or the newest version will handle that.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the importing data question. Per's not here anymore. I could talk about the difference between load following and cycle charging, or I could talk about load management. Show of hands, which one? Both? Okay, let me talk about dispatch strategies. It's mouse. So we have two basic load dispatch strategies, load following and cycle charging. So let me start with load following. It's the simplest one. It basically says the diesel never charges the battery. The dispatch strategy is really about battery charging, because we often think about dispatch strategies in terms of the diesels, but that's actually pretty straightforward. We're going to dispatch the diesels to meet the load, and we're going to do it in the least cost manner. So even though some operators may run a large generator when a smaller generator could meet the load, what Homer does is it says, of all the different options I have for meeting the load, what's the least cost option? So Homer's an optimization model. Some of your operators may not be optimizers. So in that sense, Homer's going to sort of overperform what will really happen in the field. So I had someone ask me about validating the model. One of the things that we can't validate is if the system's not being operated. Homer's assumes this is telling you this is the least cost system, and it tries to operate it in the least cost manner. And that's not necessarily what happens in the field. But getting back to the strategies here, so the diesels, Homer just figures out what's the least cost combination of generators to meet the load. But then there's this question about charging the batteries. And it's a little bit tricky because there's no way to really know for sure what's the least cost way to charge the batteries without predicting the future. About when you're going to need the energy from the batteries. And so, actually, in theory, Homer knows the future because the data's in there, and it could do that, but I didn't think that was appropriate. So we don't let Homer look ahead at all. And so the simplest approach is to say, if you choose load following, you say the diesel's never going to charge the battery. The battery is only going to be used to absorb excess renewables. Now, that's not necessarily always optimal. So cycle charging instead says, if you need to bring on the diesel because the batteries can't meet the load, then you should charge the batteries sounds reasonable. Now, if you charge the batteries too much, you may get to a situation where the batteries are full and you've got this excess wind energy, and it's not going to, and you can't, and you, it has to go either to the, it has to go to the dump load. It has to be either thrown away or gone to a low value secondary load. So it's not always optimal to charge. That's why it's not always optimal to charge the batteries with the generator. But it can be. So that's what cycle charging is for. Now, if you do cycle charging without applying the set point state of charge, the set point state of charge probably deserves some discussion because it's not intuitive what that means. There's all different kinds of set points. So let me explain what this means. So with cycle charging, if the batteries can't meet Homer would prefer to meet the load with the batteries than with the diesel because the diesel is incurring fuel costs. But if the batteries can't meet the load, it turns on the diesels. If you're in the cycle charging dispatch strategy, if it does that, it says, well, as long as the diesels are on, I might as well charge the batteries because we don't want them sitting at a low state of charge. So you charge the batteries, but when do you turn off the diesel? When do you stop charging the batteries? If you don't apply the set point state of charge, Homer will turn off the diesel as soon as possible. And so if you do cycle charging, it actually is probably a good idea to apply the set point state of charge, which says once I if I start charging the batteries with the diesel, I should keep doing that until I reach whatever set point you've set here. So if you don't do that, what Homer will do is it'll run the batteries down to their minimum state of charge, turn on the diesel, charge the batteries until it can turn off the diesel, and the battery is going to bounce around at a low state of charge, which is not the way you'd operate. It's clearly bad for the batteries. It's not the way you'd operate the batteries. So by enforcing this set point state of charge, you're saying, no, if the batteries reach a low state of charge and they can't meet the load and we need to turn on the diesel, let's turn on the diesel and leave it on and charge the batteries with the diesel and continue to charge them until we reach some set point. And so the default's 80%. It's an interesting sensitivity to do to figure out, well, what is the best set point to use? It's a little different than other sensitivities because this is actually a parameter that you have control over. So it's not an uncertainty that you don't have control over. So it's a little different. But 100% is probably not the right answer for a couple of reasons. One is then you don't have any headroom in the batteries for if the wind does start to blow. And two, it's actually pretty inefficient trying to charge the batteries up to 100%. First of all, they don't accept charge they accept charge only very slowly as they reach the top. So if you're just running the generator to charge the batteries, you're running the generator kind of inefficiently. Two, that's where the batteries become less efficient, is at high states of charge. That's when they start outgassing, electrolyzing the hydrogen, etc. And you're losing that headroom for the renewables. Now, lead-acid batteries need to be brought up to 100% every once in a while to equalize the cells. But doing it on a regular basis is just sort of inefficient. So our default's 80%, and which over time we've sort of found is kind of often the best answer, but it's worth doing a sensitivity on. Homer. Sure.
With that kind of load following strategy, are you saying then that if the generators charge your storage up to X set point, that then any variability of load, once the batteries reach that set point, is managed by the batteries? If the
Well, when we're saying load following, we're talking about the generators are just following load. They're not charging the batteries. So the battery's always following load. So I guess that's kind of confusing because you think about the battery is whether or not the battery's following load or not. But the battery can follow load. We assume that we'd rather meet the load with the battery if we can. Actually, that's not completely true. I take that back. Homer calculates what's the cost of the energy that's in the battery based on what did it cost to charge the battery. So that goes into this calculation, but it's typically the least cost way to meet the load. But there will be times, depends on your inputs, et cetera, there'll be times when you'll install a battery and Homer will never use it, and it's because the energy that went into the battery was too expensive, and it was cheaper to not use it. That's kind of an unusual case, but it's all part of this. Homer's trying to figure out what's the least cost way to meet this load. Oh, my mouse is just awful. Here we go. So load management. Okay, there's several different categories of load. So first we can come up here and show we've renamed this. Let me go to a fresh system here. So we have two primary loads. We have something called the deferrable load, and we can have two separate thermal loads. We also have this whole hydrogen capability, which I'm not going to talk about unless somebody really wants. If you all clamor for that, I can, but we don't have a lot of time, and hydrogen was of great interest for a short while, and not so much anymore. Anyway, so primary loads are essential loads, critical loads. They have to be met. If they're not met, and they're what define the operating the required operating capacity. So if there's insufficient capacity to meet the primary loads with the reserve requirements, you have a capacity shortage, which gets tallied. Primary load and why we have two primary loads. Let me just click them on. Let me click all these on just so we can see what happens. The reason we have two primary loads is because we have, you might want to do sensitivity on them separately. So let's say you had a scenario where you had a residential load with a particular shape, and then you had an industrial load that may or may not be there. Like you want to run a scenario about, okay, well, what happens if in the future this cannery goes in, or if we put in this system, does it make it suddenly cost effective for us to have a new, some kind of new load? So you wanted to be able to do a sensitivity that's not just changing the overall size of the load, but also changing the shape of the load. So you define a shape for the load that's not going to change, you define a separate shape for the load that is going to change, and Homer will just add them together, but because you can do sensitivities on them, you can actually change the shape of the load. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility. Likewise, we have a capability for either of these loads to do a very simple efficiency analysis, where we say, okay, well, would it be cost effective for us to do some sort of efficiency, DSM, demand side management program? Well, how much is that going to save? So if we think that's going to save 30%, we put 0.7 there as a multiplier. What's it going to cost, to buy all those compact fluorescents or whatever it is, whatever. And to do the economics, we need a lifetime. So you're going to spend this amount of money for these more efficient appliances. We have to amortize that cost over a certain amount of time. So this was my idea of what's the simplest way we can trade off more expensive supply options versus more expensive demand options. What's cheaper, adding renewables or increasing the efficiency on the demand side, or both? So we have a very simple efficiency module, and that ties into why we have two separate primary loads, because the efficiency might change the load shape. So by applying the efficiency to one of the loads, keeping the other loads the same, we can, so we can model that impact where the efficiency measure changes the load shape. So for example, if the efficiency measure only applied to the lighting load, we might want to define one of the two primary loads, this is the lighting load, and then apply the efficiency measure to the lighting load, which is going to be a lot bigger in the winter than the summer, and it's going to have a different daily shape, etc. And then the rest of the load doesn't get the efficiency measure. So that's one piece of our load management capability. We have another thing we call deferrable load. This was originally developed to model water pumping. So, but it can be used for other things as well. It can be used for ice making, golf cart, electric charging of things like golf carts or something. But typically water pumping. So basically imagine a water tank, and we talk about how much water is required, and we made it a bit possible for you to define that monthly, so you can capture seasonal variability in the demand for the water, let's say. This is the size of the tank. So what's happening is we're emptying this tank at a constant rate, a rate that changes monthly here. And then we're keeping track of it, and when it gets low, we have to fill it up. But if there's excess electricity, we can fill it up whenever it's a way to use the excess electricity. But it's different than a pure dump load, in that when the tank gets empty, we need to fill it, even if it means turning on the diesel. So this is an essential load, but it's one where we have some flexibility over the timing of when you meet that load. So it's, in a sense, it's a less expensive way to store excess renewable energy. It gives you some flexibility, and it should make renewables more cost effective. If one of your loads is something like water pumping, where you can store the product, and you can be flexible about within limits, about when you pump the water, that should help the renewable project. And so we built this to allow you to model that. So here under peak load, you put in the size of the pump. Storage capacity, you put in the size of the water tank. You have to sort of externally calculate the size of the water tank in terms of kilowatt hours, because we really should have put in head and cubic meters. So we may unfortunately make you do that on your own. The minimum load ratio, if the pump is either on or off, then this number should be 100%. So it's saying if it's on, it's producing at 100%. But it would be more valuable as a way of absorbing excess renewable power if you had a little more flexibility than that. But a lot of times you don't. So we put in this minimum load. Yeah?
If you had two pumps, for instance, you have 50%.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you have a community that is pumping groundwater up into a storage tank, but also has a thermal dump load, you can do this deferrable load for that pump and just say, well, as long as there's a smart controller as such that can you have excess wind, okay, let's have the pump water rather than dump load because that's useful load. And at the same time, if we don't have to pump right now, we can defer until it gets to this level, when wind is available. And if it gets to that level, then do it with diesel.
Right, exactly, exactly. But the thermal load we would handle somewhere else.
Yes.
Right. But this is more valuable than the thermal load.
Right.
So,
Can this be coordinated with, in some places they're pumping water uphill into a storage tank and then letting it flow out to generate
Right.
additional power?
oh, no,
You can't do that with
no,
okay, this doesn't do any hydro.
pumped hydro. Now we have, this is a very advanced topic and it's one of those kind of workarounds, but we have modeled pump hydro as just a really large battery. And so that's, and we have a hydro module in Homer here, right there, but that's strictly run of river. So it's a little, right.
So in that case, if you're using pump storage, you just use whatever the efficiency of that process is as the battery efficiency.
Right. It takes a little bit of thought, but it's not really that complicated. You just figure out what the appropriate parameters are in terms of efficiency and kilowatts of capacity, and you create this battery. Figure out what the reservoir size is in terms of kilowatt hours, and you've got this really simple battery that's a pumped hydro. There's some second order effects that it's not going to do, like the capacity. The head is a function of how full the what. Yeah, right. That's right. Exactly.
Evaporation.
Yeah. It's not going to take into account evaporation. Our hydro does take into account the head loss, pipe head loss, like the friction inside the pipe. So that's good. What else? I tell you, I'm running down here. Be a good time just to answer questions, or if there's something in here that I haven't covered. I did cover carbon. I covered XML a little bit. No, actually, I really didn't. Let me do that. Let me do that. I think that's really valuable. So there's a couple of different ways that works. So let me go to this file, for example. So let's say I created this generator, and it's got this cost function. It's got this fuel curve. Putting in the numbers for this fuel curve was actually a fair amount of work. Right, and I really have 3 of them, right? So I don't want to do that 3 times. So I can come in here and I go edit, copy XML, and close it. Excuse me. And then I can come here and I want to put in another generator with exactly the same characteristics. So I added a generator. I come in here and I go edit, paste XML, and now I've got an exact duplicate of that generator here. The CAT 3406, generator 2 CAT 4306. So I just copy, and if instead of copying it here, I had gone over here and exported it, now I am saving it as a file with the extension XML. So now I can create a directory with a whole library of generators, etc. So for example, one of the things I did, and so now, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but so hopefully I can find this. So here's a bunch of XML. Boy, I did this 2 years ago, so I don't actually remember what's in there. But let me go to here, diesel gensets, and I've created a whole library of caterpillars generators with this XML. And so you can create your own libraries that way. Now, another thing you can do is, if you're on the main window here, wait just one sec. If you're on the main window here, you can import and export the XML files for the entire file. So you can save it as an HMR file, or you can save it as an XML file. And that's probably of most interest to computer geeks that want to do something outside of Homer, I suppose.
I was going to say, those files for the different cat generators, are they on the community?
No, they should be.
Could be. So-
Actually, I should clear it with Caterpillar before I put them on the community
So
site.
an XML file is basically an Excel file?
No, XML, let me show you what it looks like. It's a,
I guess what's the benefit of saving the whole spreadsheet as an XML file instead of a Homer file?
you know, that's a really good question. I think it's computer readable. It's a text file. I'll show you what it looks like. I'm not enough of a computer geek to give you a really good answer about that.
Well, I guess my question is, if someone doesn't have Homer on their computer, can you send them an XML file and have them basically see the results?
It won't be the results. It'll be all of your inputs.
Oh, I see, okay.
So here's an example of it. So it's this XML is, the computer geeks really love this because it's readable by both humans and computers, so humans can't read a lot of computer files, and it's awkward to I mean binary files, you know. And it's awkward, or it's a lot of work sometimes to parse a text file so that a human can read it. But they've created this schema here, so it's got, you know, so this is, let's see, see if I can figure this out. This is which generator it is. This is its label, its name, both in long and short form. And this is all the Homer data about that generator. So the 1,000 kilowatt generator has no cost. I don't know. This is all of the data that Homer needs to know about that file, about that component. Here its lifetime is 15,000 hours. Its minimum load ratio is 25%. So, you know, if you know what XML is, people who know what XML is think this is great. People who don't know what XML is don't even need to think about it, you know. But but this ability that I showed before about creating a component library and making it really convenient and easy to add in your new components and copy components, etc. That's actually is I think is very handy. I use it all the time. So it's 5:30. I'm happy to answer questions, etc. But there's probably refreshments or something outside. I'm competing with, you know, the end of the day. So thank you all for hanging in there. But I'm going to declare victory after this question.
If you want to generate a report from Homer that is more than one screen here, or I guess you're doing the analysis, kind of it's an iterative thing, but if you want to generate a final report, is there an easy way to generate a report, or is it more just grabbing what screens interest you and as you go through?
Well, we have a report writer here. So there's several different reports. Okay, so so this little button here says HTML report, and it generates an input summary in HTML format, meaning it can be read by a browser. So this is a list of all the inputs for this run. So that's handy if you want to tell people what your assumptions were. What makes report writing challenging for Homer is because there's so much outputs. So those are all your inputs, but then what outputs belong in this report? So we can export, anytime you see this export button, we can export the data that you're looking at here into a form that's easily read by Excel. So that's the optimization results list. You can see there's the sensitivity results list. The other thing that Homer will do is when you're looking at a particular system, it can report the results for that system. So that's, when you're on simulation results, you're looking at one system. So Homer's modeled thousands of different systems. Obviously, you don't want a report that has data about all that. It's too much data. But you can create a report for this particular system. And again, it's in HTML, so it's readable by a browser. And this is called System Report. And it has let me make it visible here. It has all of the annual. Basically, it's a duplicate of the data that is on all these various tabs here. And then but anytime you're looking at a graph, if you right-click, you get these choices. Properties allows you to change colors and y-axis and labels and stuff, and you can export the data. So that's pretty much any graph you're looking at allows you to export the graph or the table behind the graph.
Can you go over the compare tab?
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a really important one. Sorry, but anyone that wants to leave it's 5:30. But so we're looking at the optimum system here, and a lot of times, frequently, a very useful thing is what's the return on investment, or what's the payback, or what's the IRR of this system? Well, that only makes sense in comparison to some other system. So, you have to go to this compare tab. It's not a property of a particular system, it's a comparison of this system to some kind of base case. So we clicked on this particular system here that's described there, and it happened to be the optimum for that sensitivity case. And we want to compare it to, let's say, the no diesel, which system are we looking at? This is yours.
No wind turbine.
Yeah, but did you model no? Oh, you did model no wind turbine.
Well, I think something with no wind turbine in those first two.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky. Oh, there it is, right there. This has an exceptionally long categorized list. Because you have so many choices of generators. Right. But we found it. So you have to define the base case. So that's what this upper part here is, to select a base case. And so we selected the status quo as the base case. And what this is showing is that it has an 11% IRR, which is not actually that fantastic now that I look at it. But it's positive. It has a simple payback of 8 years, which isn't fantastic, but it's depends on your financing, whether that's.
Right. This didn't have actual numbers; it was just throwing in numbers to
see if it works.
Model up and running and see what works. So.
Actually, I can show a case really quickly that with much better results.
Real quick, I'm sorry, when you're talking about these inputs and assumptions, it's on the board. When we get to installation costs, construction costs, is there a plug yield just for a placeholder number?
Actually, that's a pretty simple question to answer. Homer wants total installed cost. So what I think we're going to be doing for version 3 is giving you a little worksheet where you go, okay, here's the turbine cost, here's the foundation, here's the civil works, here's the labor, here's the shipping, give you some fields that you can define yourself, and I mean, it's pretty simple arithmetic, which is why I used to go, well, do it yourself. But actually, it would be handy if we had that capability in the model. It makes it hard to forget something, and Homer's origins was as a research tool internally within NREL, and now that it's playing this role of, no, we want the world to use it, and we want it to be helpful, and we want to make people's lives easier, I need to change my thinking and say, yeah, sure, it's just arithmetic, you should do it. You could do it yourself, but it would be nice if we made that easy for you. So we're changing that.
And so it goes in the report as well.
Oh yeah, good point. And also it makes it easier, like if you're doing one analysis in that presentation this morning where the cost of foundations varies from place to place, you can easily show, okay, this is this place that has the particularly difficult soils to work with, and this is this other place, and you can show exactly why the costs are different in the two different places. So I'm totally convinced that we should do that, although up until recently, I sort of resisted it because it doesn't really affect, it doesn't matter why. I'm totally sold on we need to add that to the model. Yeah.
In terms of comparison to Homer simulation results and actual results, have you modeled a current up and running system on Homer, taking a look at the results for that and the actual results that the system yields?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of that. That's another question we've gotten. Actually, PowerCorp did it on its Coral Bay project, so that's worth talking. And there was a study just recently done by a captain in the Marines. It was his master's thesis at Louisiana State, and his result was the Marines should be using Homer a lot more. It's trickier to do that kind of validation exercise than you'd think because there's all kinds of operator error, for example.
Yeah. But even if it's just choosing from one variable or maybe two, just whether it be liters of diesel saved per year, just looking at that factor alone, it doesn't have to be multiple variables, but just looking at one variable, how accurate is Homer compared to simulation results versus actual results?
Yeah, so there have been some studies done on that. We haven't done as good a job as we should be of pulling those together, and the individual components are easy to like the PV production is accurate. The wind turbine production is as accurate as the power curve that you use. So there's this whole controversy with small wind turbines about are the manufacturers exaggerating their power curves or not. One of the things that the Marine captain was an issue for him was if the battery is full, a lot of times, this is true in PV as well, it simply doesn't produce the power. And so Homer will model that as excess electricity. Well, in reality, it's excess potential electricity. It's electricity that could have been produced, but it was never produced. And Homer says, no, we produced it and then threw it away. So there's some validating requires some trick, really understanding, it's a little more involved than it sounds like it should be, but there's all kinds of issues like that show up. There was a huge validation exercise that was done on Homer's predecessor model, which is still around, Hybrid 2, some of you maybe use it. This huge exercise they did looking at this island off in Norway, Frøya. And it was useful because they discovered, some issues about the battery model. But and Maura is going to do her master's thesis on that, she just told me. So you should all stay tuned and see your master's thesis.
Can this compare economics, be exported as a report? I don't see it on here.
Well, we're creating new export report capabilities. What's going on here? Come here. Like I said, all of these graphs can be exported
Yeah,
individually.
right, and then organized on.
And yeah, so that's something we want to improve, is better.
That for us would be a selling point.
I'm sorry?
That for us would be a selling point, to have an actual report that.
Yeah. That one, I've got someone working on that.
Economics of an upgrade, basically.
Yeah. Well, we have this major upgrade coming, and that's definitely going to be in it. But in a couple of months. Yeah.
So on the wish list, could there be
I should put that.
operating parameters of a control system? Because this is saying if we control it this way, this is the results we would get. But the control system needs to control it that way in order to get those results.
Right.
So one output could be how the operating system, how the control system operates, what the parameters are, that if the load drops to this, then this happens.
Right. And the trick is to define those parameters in a way that's not too confusing. The more choices you give people, but that's definitely worth doing. But I want to really think through because I've already got some stuff in there that's non-intuitive and kind of confusing. So I'm working on that.
I guess the corollary would be if Homer exports sort of what those control assumptions are. So that the people who are actually building the control system.
Well, we definitely, anything that's an input needs to be part of the input report, what the assumptions were.
Right, but I mean, if there are other things that Homer does from those inputs that draw conclusions or do other things, and maybe it doesn't, but sort of sub-calculations that Homer does.
Intermediate calculations?
But, well,
Yeah, I suppose.
for whoever's designing the control system, hey, this is nuts, these numbers
Right.
make sense for how my control system is. You may wait a decade for those control people to have a standard enough system, but at least if they say, well, this is the way it was modeled.
What I'd really like to do is actually do that in conjunction with someone who's designing control systems and say, okay, we're modeling your controller, right?
So doing feasibility studies for communities on payoff and compare more than two kinds of turbines?
Yeah, so we only let you do 2 at a time. So that goes on the wish list?
More than,
More than, yeah.
define more than two or have an option to define more than one.
We've talked about that. I frankly don't remember whether that's on our current, it's going to be in the next version or not.
Should be very soon.
Yeah. I think I don't want to commit to it. I think that one's made it into the.
Would that go with also doing comparing more systems?
Comparing more systems?
Or you did comparison between your base and another system as a comparison? Could you have more than that?
Well, what would be
Comparing 3, or would you just do another one?
Well, here's something that I think would be useful. If you could define the base case back here, then, hold on a second. Where am I? then we could have a graph like this showing how does the IRR change, or how does the, you know, simple payback change. But we need to define the base case more globally and then compare all these different systems to that base case. So the way we do the compare right now, the history of Homer was, in the 90s, we had a lot of funding from DOE to get it going during the Village Power program. So we got it started. And then in 2001, funding for all that kind of stuff, Village Power, international activities, wind, diesel, all that stuff dried up. The Alaska wind diesel thing sort of was the last thing, was the only thing that didn't go away. And so for several years, the last few years we were at NREL, we were doing things like we knew we needed this ability to do simple payback, and we figured out, well, what's the simplest way to do that, because we don't really have any funding for it, you know? And the same thing with the way we do the efficiency measures. Well, that's a really valuable capability. What's the minimum thing we can do to make that available? And so I don't really think the way we do this simple payback, it's not, there's a whole bunch of things like that which we're in the process of fixing now, that we've got, we're not under DOE anymore, you know? Well, listen, thanks, you know, I appreciate you guys all sticking around. I was afraid I was boring you and you're all gonna leave as soon as possible. But it's time for a drink.